Welcome to Know Thyself on the Value and Limits of Self-Knowledge. My name is Mitch Green. I teach at the University of Connecticut. In today's class, we'll be discussing Socrates and his views about the examined life. First, I want to talk a little bit about the oracle at Delphi. The phrase know thyself is an English translation of the Greek dictum gnothi sagton. That's my very loose transliteration of the original Greek. These words were, according to legend, carved into stone at the entrance to the temple of Apollo at Delphi, Greece. This temple dates at least as far back as the 8th century BC and was at the height of its influence between the 6th and the 4th centuries BC. The above dictum is only one of over 100 that were carved into the walls of the temple. Among the others were shun murder, crown your ancestors, and control the eye. However, the injunction to know oneself is probably the most famous of all of them. According to Greek legend, Zeus released 2 eagles at opposite ends of the world, and they met at what is now Delphi, which as a result came to be called the omphalos, or navel of the world. According to some scholars, intoxicating vapor flowed out of a subterranean cavern, and a priestess known as the Pythian would inhale this vapor and enter an altered state of consciousness. Representatives of city-states from all over Greater Greece would come to Delphi seeking the Pythian's advice. It was thought that the priestess could not be in error in answering questions put to her. However, perhaps due to her intoxication, the Pythian's utterances required interpretation. As a result, usually male priests would sometimes act as intermediaries between the priestess and the public. But even with the aid of their interpretation, the priest's words had to be construed carefully. According to one famous story, King Croesus of Lydia consulted the oracle to determine whether he should attack Cyrus the Great and his Persian army. The oracle replied that if he attacked the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus took this reply as advice to attack, but when he did so, his army and consequently his own empire were destroyed. Socrates was a philosopher whose dates were 469 to 399 BC. He was the son of a midwife and a sculptor. He never published a word. He spent most of his time hanging out in the agora, which is the Greek version of a marketplace where people buy and sell things. They share gossip. Sometimes aspiring politicians will try to make speeches before they get shouted out. Socrates tended to question others rather than espousing his own views, and he, as a result, became the namesake of what we now refer to as the Socratic method in teaching, in which a teacher tries not to tell her students anything, but gets them to come to realizations primarily by asking questions. Rather than work in a job such as sculpting or sandal making, Socrates could usually be found in this agora, engaging in conversation with a respected Athenian citizen or one of the city's many visitors. In these conversations, Socrates would typically raise a question about the nature of justice or virtue, piety or knowledge. More often than not, Socrates would show his interlocutor that their answer was unacceptable in some way. For instance, as a result of being inconsistent or as a result of not cohering with something else that the person accepts. This had 2 consequences. First of all, it gained Socrates a small band of followers who found these conversations fascinating. These followers were aristocratic young men who had the leisure time to spend their days in discussion rather than at work. Among the young men in his entourage are Crito, Xenophon, Cratylus, and Plato, who came to write down many of the dialogues that he witnessed between Socrates and others. Second, Socrates' way of conducting himself and the entourage of aristocratic followers that it generated over time provoked the ire of some of Athens' most prominent citizens. Some of them might have been parents of the aforementioned young men. Others might have been among those whose conversations with Socrates showed that they knew less about virtue, wisdom, and the like than they thought they did. This ire grew over the years until a formal accusation was lodged against Socrates. What was the charge? Well, it included such things as, he corrupts the youth of our city, and he makes the worse argument the stronger, and he busies himself studying things in the sky and the earth, in addition to, he teaches these same things to others. Socrates will defend himself against 501 of his fellow Athenians. Their juries were much bigger in those days than they are as is familiar to us now, and he finds himself surrounded by that many jurors as he comes to take the stage to defend himself against his accusations. As he warms up to his defense, and this defense, by the way, is called the apology, although that is just a transliteration of the Greek word apologia, which means defense. By no means is Socrates being apologetic. In the course of warming up to his defense of his own actions, Socrates mentions sophists, for example, Evenus the sophist, because he's been accused of teaching, of conveying his alleged knowledge to others about earth and sky and so on. But Socrates says, I don't have the knowledge that you claim that I've got. If I were a sophist like Evenus is, then maybe I would, but I don't claim to be any such thing. These sophists traveled typically from one city-state or polis to another in ancient Greece. Evenus himself charged 500 drachmas to attend his course, where 1 drachma is equivalent to about what a day laborer would earn in one day. Other sophists include Gorgias, Prodicus, and Hippias. And Socrates says, I'm envious of these men. I wish I had the knowledge that they claim to have. Certainly I would pride and preen myself if I had this knowledge, the kind of knowledge that these sophists claim to have, but I do not have any such knowledge. And I can tell you that, I can prove that to you by calling upon my friend Chaerephon, who is a friend of mine since childhood, and he went to the oracle at Delphi and asked the oracle a question. His question was, is anyone wiser than Socrates? And the oracle came back with the answer, no. Socrates says, I was astonished to hear this news. This was shocking to me. I couldn't believe it. Let's stand back from that answer for just a moment before we move on to interpret the answer that Socrates' his friend Chaerephon got and conveyed to Socrates himself. Let's be careful about what it means. When we say, for example, that no one is taller than George, that does not mean that George is the tallest one in the room. Everybody might be the same height. Likewise, if we say that no one's wiser than Socrates, that might be that everybody has exactly the same amount of wisdom, including such possibilities as that no one has any wisdom at all. Keeping in mind the example of Croesus and the harm that he came to as a result of rashly interpreting the oracle's pronouncement, let's make sure we're careful about what the oracle said to Socrates' friend. So Socrates says to his audience, what does the god mean in saying that no one is wiser than I? What is his riddle? Socrates then goes on to tell his audience that he went to those reputed wise. He says, I proceeded systematically. I went to the politicians, and then to the poets, and then to the craftsmen. And he says, I found that those who had the highest reputation were nearly the most efficient, while those who were thought inferior were generally the most knowledgeable. That is to say, when I would ask politicians their answers to the questions about things that matter most in life, knowledge, wisdom, virtue, justice, etc., I found they had views on these matters, but views that they could not justify, and that probably would come to grief if we were to develop those views and try to work out their consequences. Likewise with the poets, they were able to write wonderful poetry, but they couldn't explain what it meant. They didn't seem to understand what they were doing. And likewise, the craftsmen, the people who were responsible for fashioning oars for our triremes or building urns for shipping and preserving goods and so on, are wonderful at what they do. But when they get the opportunity to pronounce on things outside of their own expertise, such as politics and justice and the proper running of a state, they don't seem to have any more wisdom than even a child. So Socrates says, I soon realized that poets don't compose their poems with knowledge. Likewise, craftsmen don't do what they do with any special kind of knowledge either. And he concludes, I became unpopular. And I've lived in great poverty as a result because of my service to the god. That is to say, in trying to understand the riddle that came from the oracle at Delphi, I have become unpopular because I've gone around trying to find someone who's wiser than I am, and I've failed miserably at doing so. After reciting that part of his narrative, Socrates concludes, well, maybe the Pythian, the priestess, had a point, though, because perhaps I'm wiser than others to this small extent. That is, these others take themselves to have knowledge. They take themselves to have wisdom about these important matters in life, but I don't. I'm aware of my ignorance, whereas others are not. And so he tells his audience, so I withdrew and thought to myself, I'm wiser than this man, for example, this politician who claims to know about how to run a state in a just manner. It's likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not, whereas when I do not know, neither do I think I know. So I'm likely to be wiser than he is to this small extent, that I do not think I know what I do not in fact know. Let's stand back from that just a moment and ask ourselves, what does that teach us about wisdom? It seems to me one can be knowledgeable but still behave foolishly. One can have a great deal of information at one's fingertips, but not know how to apply it in a way that is useful, expedient, prudent, or helpful. But one can't be wise and behave foolishly. It seems to me the concept of wisdom is connected up with the idea of acting in a way that is more or less beneficial, or more or less prudential, or more or less reasonable. Notice that even a prodigy, someone who's young and extremely brilliant at mathematics or music, for example, could still act foolishly, that is, could still act unwisely. One who takes himself to be knowledgeable, for example, Croesus, is apt to act foolishly, while one who acknowledges his limitations or her limitations is less likely to do that, for the reason that they'll be aware of the fact, for example, that there are multiple ways to interpret the words of a pronouncement. There are multiple ways of understanding a concept or a theory, and until we get clear on precisely which is the best justified one, we should try to remain as neutral as possible until it's time to act, until it's time to make a decision. So the idea is that Socrates may have a point in suggesting that, insofar as he's equally ignorant as anybody else, except for the slight difference that he's aware of his ignorance, others are not, and that awareness makes him slightly wiser than others. To that extent, he's got an edge over his fellow Athenians. So he's now stated his overall point of view. He thinks he's not more knowledgeable than others, except for this little bit. He's aware of the fact that he doesn't have knowledge of answers to these important questions, but that he thinks also makes him a bit wiser than others. We distinguish knowledge and wisdom now. He thinks he's a bit wiser than others because he thinks he's less likely to act imprudently, because he doesn't have these presumptions, these hubris that makes him think that he knows what he's talking about. So now he calls in Meletus, one of his accusers, and he says, "Look, Meletus, you say that I corrupt the youth of Athens and that I don't believe in the gods of our city, but rather in other gods." And he's going to proceed to question Meletus. This is a good example of Socratic method where, as we've mentioned before, Socratic method is that method of trying to get somebody to come to a realization without telling them anything at all. That's the purest form of Socratic method, would be one in which you didn't make any statements at all. Socrates calls up Meletus and asks him, "Well, who improves the youth of this city or any other?" Meletus answers rather snarkily, "Everyone but you." And Socrates replies, "Well, okay, who improves horses?" Meletus answers, "Horse trainers improve horses. Other people who don't have expertise about horses presumably don't." Socrates says, "Right, we can agree on that one." Well, what about this? Do the wicked harm and do the good people benefit others? Do wicked people harm other people and good people benefit other people? Meletus says, "Yes, I think that's the case." Next question. Would anyone will to be harmed, that is, set out to do themselves harm? Meletus thinks not. Socrates next asks him, "Well, are you suggesting that insofar as I, like everybody else, would not will to be harmed, but that I nevertheless am one who hurts others by corrupting the youth, are you suggesting that I corrupt the youth deliberately?" Meletus says, "Yes, I certainly am." And then Socrates replies essentially by showing that Meletus can't be consistent here, because if he thinks that Socrates is deliberately corrupting the youth, Socrates points out, I must be also at least putting myself at risk of harming myself too, because I hang out with these youth. I've got this entourage of young men who spend a great deal of time with me. So if I'm corrupting them, I'm probably going to be corrupting myself as well. No one would wish to do such a thing, so the idea that I'm corrupting the youth wouldn't make any sense. But Meletus does not give him a satisfactory answer to that charge that Meletus is being incoherent. Socrates has to continue the discussion on his own, essentially. But he points out that if I really am corrupting youth, then I risk harming myself, which doesn't seem like a particularly coherent thing to do. He continues on, and pointing out that, look, I could get myself off these charges probably by calling in my family and friends and begging for mercy in front of this jury. I could ask for your forgiveness and promise never to go around Athens talking about these philosophical questions again. But he says, that would not make a whole lot of sense for me. I'm not sure that it would still be worth continuing my life in such a situation, because it's so important for me to engage in this kind of dialogue with others. I could go off to another city-state and just keep my mouth shut, but that wouldn't be a particularly worthwhile form of existence. He also points out, to fear death is to think oneself wise when one is not. You might think that I'm afraid of being put to death, but in fact I'm not. For the reason that if I were afraid of being put to death, I would thereby be presuming that I have some idea what that would be like, what the experience of death would actually be like. But I have no idea. I don't claim to have any idea. Somebody who is afraid of death seems to be presuming that they have some sense of what that would come to. He also points out that he takes himself to be something like a gadfly on the noble steed that is Athens. That is to say, he suggests that Athens, one of the, or if not the leading city-state in ancient Greece at the time, is this beautiful and striking and elegant steed. That's the metaphor that he uses. And Socrates describes himself as a gadfly buzzing around it, trying to provoke and annoy it in order to make it more active and less lethargic. After making these remarks, the jury votes and decides to give him a verdict as well as a sentence. The verdict is guilty. The sentence is death. Socrates seems unperturbed by this result and formulates his equanimity by saying, well, the unexamined life is not worth living for men, so I'm not so upset with my fate, because the other option would be to cease engaging in self-examination, and that would be worth nothing to me. One further dimension of this course that I'd like to introduce you to now is that of the meditative moment, where I'll be asking you to spend just a couple of minutes engaging in some very, I hope, non-threatening, not too challenging meditation. And by meditation, I don't mean anything spiritual, anything transcendental at all, but just a way of trying to focus the mind, calm the mind. And part of what I'm aiming at is to help you realize that many of us, I don't know about all, but many of us are probably multitasking to our detriment. And if we can begin to think about monotasking, begin to think about focusing on the here and now, what project we're engaged in, we perhaps might be able to pay attention more intensely and thereby achieve what we want to in a more satisfying, fulfilling way. And one step in that direction is the meditative moment, where I'll just ask you to spend a minute or two doing something, doing very little of something, and then with luck that will help you to, so to speak, calm the waters of the mind. So this is a meditation bowl that I picked up in Singapore many years ago. I'm going to strike it, and I'll ask you to pay attention to the sound that I make. I'll use a little clapper to revolve around it to make a kind of resonant sound. Ask you to think about that. And then try to focus on the sound, focus on nothing but the sound. And if you have some other thoughts that come your way, acknowledge them, maybe even mentally say hello to them, and let them float on by like clouds in the sky as you go back to thinking about the sound. The claim that the unexamined life is not worth living is one of the more famous from the Western philosophical tradition. You probably have heard it before. But if you think about it, getting beyond the familiarity and take a closer look at it, I think you might notice that it's pretty controversial. Notice, first of all, that when he said the unexamined life is not worth living for men, he's restricting it to the case of men, and we might point out that that seems like kind of a sexist remark, as in fact it is. As a matter of fact, Greek society at the time was incredibly sexist. Women, for the most part, had a status only slightly higher than that of slaves. But let's set that aside. That's an important problem, but not a problem that we want to focus on here in this course so much. Let's set that aside for now. We'll come back to issues of bias and prejudice later on. For now, I want to let's reformulate that as just the claim that the unexamined life is not worth living and see whether that's really plausible. Well, first of all, we want to get clear on what an examined life actually would be for Socrates and his milieu. As far as I can see, the examined life for Socrates and his friends was primarily a matter of spending as much time as you could engaged in discourse and inquiry about life's most important concepts like justice and virtue, piety, truth, wisdom, knowledge, and the like. That is to say, living an examined life involves primarily spending time with yourself, or even better, with others, engaging in dialogue, trying to get a better sense of what these concepts come to, and thereby, and likewise, how we should apply them in our lives. But if that's right, then living a life that does not engage in self-examination seems like it's going to apply to a great many people, and a great many people whose lives seem unproblematic in various ways. So, for example, we can imagine in contemporary thought what it would be to live a life that's not worth living. That life would be one that would involve a lot of suffering, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all that's missing is living an examined life in Socrates' sense. What I mean is this: bioethicists who study ethics, especially as it applies to healthcare, medical intervention, quality of life issues, and so on, bioethicists talk about the zero line. And you can imagine cases, I think, in which somebody might plausibly fall below or just spend their entire life below the zero line. Think about a little baby. She's born and she has a congenital disease that doctors don't know how to cure. She never seems to be able to enjoy any moments of time that she spends by herself or with others. She always seems to be uncomfortable. She never seems to engage in social interaction with her parents. She just seems unhappy by no fault of her own. She's just very sick. And then perhaps after 6 months, she passes away. This life of 6 months of suffering, pretty much uninterrupted suffering, we might feel is below the zero line in the sense that some of us might feel, and I don't need to say that all of us would rightly feel this way, but you can understand why somebody would feel that it would be better if she had never been born. Suppose that is a reasonable point of view. That's an example of somebody, if that's correct, who lives below the zero line. But not engaging in self-examination or living an examined life in Socrates' sense seems like it's a very different kind of thing. And we can imagine many people who don't engage in self-examination, but who live lives that seem awfully worthwhile. So, for example, consider Nira, who's a campaigner working to protect women from being tricked into human trafficking. Maybe she goes around poor villages and tries to let adolescent girls become aware of the fact that they're in danger of being tricked by men in slick clothes and slick cars who make them promises of fancy jobs in the big city. She tells them, look, that's a trick. They'll take your passport. You'll never get it back. You'll essentially become a slave. Watch out for these guys. Don't be tricked by them. Stay at home and let's not let those guys into our town in the first place, if at all possible. Nira spends all day and all of her energy trying to help these adolescent girls be protected against this kind of human trafficking. Seems like a very worthwhile activity, but she doesn't have time for examination during the daytime or even after she gets home from work. She's too tired. She just collapses. So the idea is that here's a person whose life seems awfully worthwhile. After all, she's helping save scores, maybe hundreds of young women from being tricked into the human trafficking system. And yet she does not have time for examining the nature of truth or justice, knowledge, wisdom, as the case may be. It seems awfully high-handed for Socrates to say that Nira does not live an examined life. Or imagine someone else who wants to spend all of his effort on trying to save animals that have been put in so-called kill shelters. That is, if they're not taken out soon enough, then they'll be euthanized. Suppose this other person spends all of his time, as much time as he possibly can, trying to convince potential pet owners to take these animals out of kill shelters and bring them home so that they're not put to death. Seems like a worthwhile activity. Seems like a viable and noble enterprise. And yet he doesn't have time for living an examined life in Socrates' sense either. So it seems awfully high-handed to say that these two individuals are like the little baby who died after 6 months of pretty much uninterrupted suffering. You might understand why she's below the zero line, but these other two, that they're below the zero line, seems awfully perhaps elitist, high-handed, very narrow as a conception of what makes life worthwhile, what kind of life is worth living. So we want to see whether we can find an interpretation of what Socrates has to say that might be a little bit more expansive rather than find it just as an extreme and perhaps very implausible point of view. Such an alternative interpretation of Socrates' dictum is available. The Professor Richard Kraut has written an article called The Examined Life, in which he suggests that there's another alternative reading of what Socrates has to say in this dialogue, in the Apology, that might make that dictum out to be a little bit more plausible. So Professor Kraut goes to the original Greek and finds the sentence that formulates the unexamined life is not worth living to contain the word biotos, which can be interpreted as to be lived in such a way that allows us to interpret the entire dictum as saying the unexamined life, instead of the unexamined life is not worth living, instead the unexamined life is not to be lived. And notice how that has a different meaning from the original. Not to be lived means something like it's something you should avoid. But saying that there's something you should avoid does not mean that if you don't avoid it, your life is not worthwhile. So take an example such as the following. I was once listening to the radio late one night. I think I was studying back in my college days, maybe listening to some jazz. And the DJ came on and said, "Man, if you don't dig that music, you've got a hole in your soul." And I thought to myself, that's an interesting claim. What do it mean to have a hole in my soul? Well, the idea seems to be something like this, that I'm missing something of value. If I'm not able to appreciate the music of, I don't know, maybe it was Charles Mingus, for instance. If I'm not able to appreciate that, then there's something that's worthwhile that I'm missing, which if I were to live a fuller, more complete life, I would have as something I had available as a source of appreciation. Doesn't mean that if I don't have it, my life is not worth living, but it does mean that to live a full life, that's something I'd want to have. So likewise, we can interpret Socrates as saying that if you don't engage in self-examination, then you're missing something of value. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be alive. That just means that just like you should be able to appreciate jazz, there are certain foods you should be able to enjoy. There are certain kinds of interpersonal relationships you should be able to enjoy. So too, one thing that makes a life worth living, one thing that makes it worth living is going to be the engagement and examination on life's most important questions. And we can give examples of characters from Platonic dialogues who provide nice cases of lives that are insufficiently examined by the owners of those lives, by the people in question. That is, they are doing things that seem unwise precisely because they are lacking in self-examination of the appropriate kind. So, for example, Euthyphro. In a famous dialogue, Socrates runs into an old friend Euthyphro in the law courts. And Socrates says, "Hey, Euthyphro, what brings you here? I know I've been charged by my fellow Athenians with doing bad things, but what brings you to the law courts?" Euthyphro's answer is, "Well, I'm here to prosecute my father." Socrates' answer is, "Well, that's an unusual thing to do. Why would you prosecute your father?" Euthyphro answers, "Well, because he killed one of our employees, and I consider that to be murder, and so I want to prosecute him." Socrates replies, "Well, you must have a lot of confidence about your own knowledge of right and wrong, and you must be very sure of your knowledge of right and wrong to be able to do something so striking and unconventional as to prosecute your own father for murder." And Euthyphro says, "Yes, I certainly do know the difference between right and wrong, and that's why I'm confident I have got the courage of my convictions here." Socrates proceeds to question Euthyphro about the nature of his confidence, about the basis, about his account of what makes right acts right and wrong acts wrong. And it doesn't take too long before Socrates is able to show Euthyphro that he is not really clear about what he's talking about, that his understanding of right and wrong is based on a confusion. So Euthyphro seems like an example of someone who's launching into a potentially disastrous line of activity, namely prosecuting his own father for murder, because of his tenuous grasp of ethical truth. Another example is Crito. After Socrates has been sentenced to death, he's in prison. The day is coming when he's going to have to be drinking some hemlock and taking his own life. His friend Crito sneaks into his cell one morning and says, "Good morning, Socrates. Let's get up. Let's get moving. I think I'm in a position to bribe the jailers, and I've got a disguise for you. Why don't you let me help you? We can sneak you out of Athens, take you to another city-state, and you'll be safe there for the rest of your life." Socrates says, "Nothing doing. I'm going to stay here and just accept my sentence." Crito says, "But that would be terrible. First of all, we'll lose one of our closest friends, namely you, if you die. Secondly, I will be subject to potential embarrassment because everybody will say, 'Crito, we know you had the money to bribe the jurors to help Socrates out of prison. Why didn't you do that? Were you just being cheap?'" So Crito is worried that his reputation will be hurt if Socrates is in fact put to death. Socrates replies to this in the following way: "Look, your standing in the opinion of others shouldn't matter to you. What matters is the opinion of wise people, not just people generally. And if you're worried about losing some face because people think that you're being cheap, then let them think what they want. Insofar as that's something that you think matters, you're mistaken." So here's another example I think Socrates would say, and I think also our contemporary philosopher Richard Kraut would say, would be an example of an insufficiently examined life. Crito is not thinking carefully about why it matters to him what other people think. A third example is Glaucon, Plato's older brother. In another famous Platonic dialogue called The Republic, Glaucon considers the following possibility. He's heard about the myth of the ring of Gyges, the ring which, if you come to own, will make you invisible. And Glaucon says, "I'd be awfully tempted to put on that ring. I could steal a lot of things, have my way in all kinds of matters. What's to keep me from grabbing that ring if I could and advancing in life in various ways that seem awfully tempting to me? I'm not sure that that's the right thing, but Socrates, tell me why it wouldn't be the right thing." And likewise, you can imagine a contemporary version of that. Suppose you had a kind of technological analog of that ring that allowed you to sneak into various databases and change the number of zeros in your checking account, or change your test scores, your credit rating, whatever other numbers matter to your life without anybody finding out. If you could be sure that you wouldn't suffer the consequences of being caught, you might be tempted to do one of those things. Socrates says to Glaucon, however, that, look, if you were to get gains, acquire things in these illegitimate ways, even if you don't get caught, the things that you would gain would not be worth very much to you because you didn't earn them. So the idea that these things would be attractive, that if you could get them by, so to speak, cheating with this ring of Gyges, shows that you're not living an examined life sufficiently, because these things would probably not make you happy in the end. They probably wouldn't be worth very much. And a final example that we can think of is the person named Ion, who's a rhapsode, someone who goes around ancient Greece to the different city-states and makes a living out of reciting Homeric poetry. But he doesn't understand what the lines of poetry means. He doesn't understand what the stories are about. He just recites the lines. So that's a fairly extreme case of an unexamined life in which Ion just sort of utters the words, but does so without understanding. And I'm guessing that you could probably think of characters, either people in your own life or fictional characters that you've come across in novels, plays, movies, etc., that run into, or at least are in danger of running into, some kind of trouble because they live insufficiently examined lives. We can also think about, for example, slogans that we commonly hear nowadays that are attractive, they're popular, we hear them often enough that we become inured to them, but we might also wonder whether or not they could do with some more examination. So, for example, there's a line from a Sheryl Crow song that runs, "If it makes you happy, it can't be that bad." But think about that. If it makes you happy, it can't be that bad. Well, what if it's something that makes you happy that requires the suffering of other people? Some people get a great deal of pleasure out of watching other people suffer. The one German word that refers to this is Schadenfreude. And if that's the source of your happiness, it's still not that bad. Other people will consider you to be cruel if you're caused to be happy, if you find pleasure in somebody else's downfall. So the familiar, comfortable slogan, "If it makes you happy, it can't be that bad," is one that could do with some more examination, perhaps. Or in many countries, we see people say things like, "My country, right or wrong." That's a slogan that becomes comfortable with repetition, but it should also be subject to further examination. Does that mean a country couldn't possibly do something immoral and couldn't possibly justify us in a certain amount of civil disobedience? That's a question that many people would be tempted to answer in the affirmative. And likewise, you hear people say things like, "Everything happens for a reason." And while that might be true in the sense that everything except for the decay of electrons from something radioactive, everything else seems to happen for a reason, in the sense that there's a cause, a physical cause for it, that may be true. But if you want to suppose that everything that happens, there's a reason that somehow justifies it, makes it okay, makes it admissible or acceptable, that's a further thing entirely, and something that's much more questionable. When someone has a terrible tragedy happen to them, they might learn from it, they might acquire some wisdom from that experience, but that doesn't mean that that was a justified or reasonable or appropriate thing to have happen in their lives. It may be, but just the fact that it happened doesn't mean that there was a reason for it in the sense we're talking about now. And thinking more about what it means to live an examined life, we can also consider how, as we go back to our own selves and our own ways of being, think about the ways in which we accept slogans such as these without very much thought. And sometimes that makes us a little bit dogmatic. So when Oscar Wilde, for example, was in prison, he wrote a collection of letters called De Profundis. In one passage in one of his letters, he says the following: "It's tragic how few people ever possess their souls before they die. Nothing is more rare in any man," says Emerson, he's quoting Emerson now, "than an act of his own. It's quite true. Most people are other people. Their thoughts are someone else's opinions. Their lives a mimicry, their passions a quotation." The idea that my passions, my emotions are a quotation suggests that so much of what I'm doing is just reiterating something that's come before. And if that's right, then I might also be living an insufficiently examined life for the reason that I'm just following in the footsteps of others, not coming up with anything authentic that is uniquely my own. And there's a case in which also I'm going with the flow, running with the herd, and not examining my own existence in such a way as to ask, is this the one that I want to have? You'll see throughout this course that I try to channel lots of different points of view and represent different types of criticism to the views that we're discussing. That's kind of what philosophers do for a living. And I will also, in that same spirit, want to imagine a challenge to even the qualified, the unexamined life is not to be lived version of Socrates' dictum. You can imagine someone challenging even that, so that they say, look, I agree that not engaging in self-examination doesn't make your life not worth living. We're all on the same page there. But is it even true that not engaging in self-examination is something that is not to be done, something that is to be avoided? What's wrong with not engaging in self-examination exactly? After all, if you think about, somebody might also say, the unmusical life is not worth living, and the life that doesn't involve seeing sunsets is not worth living, and the life that doesn't involve traveling around the world or engaging in a certain kind of yoga is not worth living. You can imagine someone saying each of those things and doing so honestly, sincerely. What's so special about self-examination? So you can imagine Ella. She's a surfer, a very good surfer. She especially spends a lot of time on the famous coastline off of Cape Town, South Africa. And she says, look, my surfing, I'm good at it. I'm good enough to occasionally win competitions so I can make a living out of this thing. And I have a great time. I'm very happy. I don't feel like I'm missing anything else. Are you going to tell me that my life is missing something? Not that it's not worthwhile, not that it shouldn't be lived, but that it's missing something. I'd come back to you and say, I could engage in self-examination. That would be fine, but it's not my thing. I don't get into it. What I get into is being on my surfboard, enjoying the waves, enjoying the weather, enjoying the excitement of looking for waves and riding them as far as I can. What's wrong with that? So Socrates, in his reformulated version of his dictum, still, I think, owes us an answer to that question. Why it is that this, as it were, what you might think of as a pluralist challenge to the Socratic dictum, even the modified one, why that pluralist challenge is one that he can respond to. And I think he might respond as follows. Granted, you might be fully and completely satisfied with the sort of life you're living, spending most of your days surfing. That's fine. But think about the process of self-examination and living an examined life of the sort that I'm recommending as being something like building up some life insurance against the kinds of surprises that life has a funny way of throwing at us. It's not likely that you're going to be able to surf every day for the rest of your life. Eventually, weather patterns might change because of global warming, or you might damage a knee, or you might hurt your back and find yourself unable to surf as long as you would like to. You'll probably want to take up something else. And rather than have to start from scratch, having thought beforehand about why it is that this life is the one that you choose, why it is that this life is the one that makes you happy, is one that will help you probably move on to a next step thereafter. So too, each of us has many things that we enjoy, many things that we appreciate, and my set of things that I enjoy might or might not overlap with yours. There'll probably be a great deal of divergence from one person to another. But insofar as each of us can say why it matters to us, why we care about the things that we do, we'll be more likely to move on when one thing becomes less available than it had been before. Move on to other things that give us satisfaction and make us happy. Now notice that insofar as we're doing this, insofar as we're trying to respond to Ella's challenge, this pluralist challenge, we're also moving away slightly from Socrates' conception of self-examination or living an examined life, which involves discussing and debating about the nature of justice, truth, virtue, wisdom, and the like, and moving a little bit more towards a contemporary notion of self-examination that involves a certain amount of introspection, taking account of our preferences and things that make us happy. That's something that you don't hear much from in Socrates, but in order for him to respond adequately to the challenge that Ella and pluralism generally offer, I think you would have to take a page from a more modern conception of self-examination that involves paying attention to what we care about as individuals, as opposed to these more abstract notions such as examining justice, truth, wisdom, knowledge, and the like. But once we've done that, once we've made that slight concession to a more expansive notion of what examination is supposed to examine when we're trying to understand ourselves, not just these broad concepts, but individual preferences and things that give us pleasure, that might be enough to provide an adequate response to the sort of challenge that the pluralist offers. Let me say also that we've presupposed thus far the nature of knowledge, and I want to expand on what knowledge is in our discussion. Knowledge, is the way Socrates understands it, is different from true opinion. True opinion is when I've got a belief about a question and that belief happens to be true. And that itself is not knowledge. Why? Well, I might make a lucky guess, for example. You might say, hey, there's a jar full of jelly beans in the next room. How many do you think are in there? And I say, 473. Suppose I'm right. It was a complete lucky guess. I had no chance to ever look at the jar, no idea how big it was, what the size of the jelly beans were inside of there, and so forth. Suppose I got it right. I think we would not normally say that I knew how many jelly beans were there. I just made a lucky guess. Likewise, if I have no opinion on a question, I don't even have an opinion, but suppose it just happens to be the case that there are 473 jelly beans in there, but I'm completely neutral on that question. Of course, we there too would not say that I know how many jelly beans there are. If anything, Socrates would want to say, in order to count as knowing, and in addition, we'd have to have what Socrates would call an account. The idea being that I'd have to be able to answer the question, if you ask me, how do you know that? What's your reason? I'd have to be able to give something like, well, I was able to look at that jelly bean jar for a long time and I counted. It took a long time, but I finally did. Or I dumped them all out and counted one by one. Or maybe I measured the circumference and the height and looked at the size of the average jelly bean and got a pretty good estimate. Would that count quite as enough of a justification? I'm not sure, but it would come reasonably close. So the idea is that knowledge in the ancient tradition, in the tradition going back to the ancient Greeks, is known as knowledge construed as justified true belief. For me to know that something is the case, it has to be the case. I've got to believe it to be the case, and I've got to be able to give an account, or in modern terms, we would say I've got to be able to give some kind of justification for that. Notice that being certain of something is not enough for knowledge. So, for example, I might buy a lottery ticket, and for whatever reason, be certain that I'm going to win. But it's not clear, unless I've rigged the system, it's not clear that I could ever know that I'm going to win the lottery, even if I'm certain. So let's make sure to distinguish between certainty and knowledge. Certainty might come from my having justification, but it's justification that does the work and not the certainty. Notice also that we're presupposing, or have presupposed thus far, that knowledge is of propositions. This is known as propositional knowledge. That is, what I know is a proposition that something is the case. We can distinguish when we're putting a lot of emphasis in coming weeks on a different notion of knowledge, which is something more like knowing how. So I could know that 2 plus 2 is 4, or a squared plus b squared equals c squared for the sides of a right triangle. But I could also know how to tie a shoe, or to make a certain kind of cake, or to ride a bicycle. Those types of knowledge are genuine types of knowledge, but they're not so much directed towards propositions as that they correspond to skills of various kinds. In addition, knowing how includes such things as knowing what an experience is like. So I know how or know what it's like or how it feels, for example, to be sprayed by a skunk or to break an arm. Because I can, so to speak, recreate that experience if I need to. I know how to bring that experience up into memory, for example. And likewise, knowing how includes such things as knowing what somebody else's, for example, emotional situation is like. We're going to have a discussion later on in this course on empathy, and empathy, and the way we'll understand it here, is going to be a special type of knowing how, construed essentially as a matter of knowing how to put myself into somebody else's shoes. So knowledge, as you can imagine, given that it's a course on self-knowledge, is going to play a crucial role in our discussion, and it helps right now to distinguish between knowledge that and knowledge how. And we might ask, there's justification for knowledge that's required. In order to know that something's the case, I've got to have justification. A question for you to ponder for now is just, is there an analog of justification for knowledge how? Summing up then, we talked about the temple at ancient Delphi, and there are remnants of it that you can see even today. And one of the slogans at that temple was that one should know oneself. That's what visitors were exhorted to do, among other things. This provides our first example of a people that are appealing to and apparently placing value on self-knowledge. Knowing oneself requires a certain amount of self-examination, but not in a sense that would come most naturally to contemporary readers, that is, knowing oneself in the ancient Greek tradition. Instead, self-examination, as understood by Socrates, requires investigating through debate and dialogue the contours of concepts that seem necessary for living a good life, including such things as knowledge, justice, virtue, piety, and the like. As we recall, Socrates heard from the oracle at Delphi that had pronounced that no one was wiser than he. He found this unbelievable and sought to disprove it, and he spent many years attempting to do just that, to prove that the oracle was wrong. He learns from his failure to do so that, unlike those who mistakenly and complacently think themselves to be knowledgeable, he at least is aware of his shortcomings, and that seems a basis for his having a slight edge in wisdom compared to his fellow Athenians. But he also provokes a lot of ire among others in the process, and he's, as a result, put on trial for a number of charges, defends himself and his actions by explaining that he was trying to disprove the oracle. He's nevertheless found guilty and sentenced to death. After that sentence, Socrates tells his audience that the unexamined life is not worth living, and we can interpret that as implying that most people live lives that are not worth living, or we may take it to mean that the unexamined life is not to be lived. The latter interpretation seems a more reasonable interpretation of what Socrates says, though it's still challenged by the pluralist position that we considered. And various characters from Plato's dialogues may be seen as failing to live examined lives in one way or another. Even contemporary slogans that you hear in popular music and so on seem to suggest a lack of examination. We introduced a distinction between propositional knowledge and ability knowledge. We talked about how propositional knowledge requires justified true belief. Is there an analog of something like that for the case of justification specifically? For ability knowledge, we'll come back to that question. But it seems like both types of knowledge are going to be relevant to our inquiry into self-understanding. Welcome back to Know Thyself on the Value and Limits of Self-Knowledge. Today, our second class will be entitled Descartes' Essence, and as you can guess, it will be about the philosopher named Descartes. René Descartes was a philosopher whose dates were 1596 to 1650. And he was a French philosopher, scientist, as well as a mathematician. He was the inventor of analytic geometry. He's the person after whom the Cartesian coordinate system is named. If you've done any graphing, you've probably used Cartesian coordinate systems. And he had interest in optics and meteorology as well. And he's commonly credited with inventing what we now refer to as the modern era of philosophy. In philosophy, things move pretty slowly, so that in other fields, what's referred to as modern might refer to the last 10 or 15 years, whereas in philosophy, what we refer to as modern tends to be about the last 4 centuries. And Descartes was, it seems, wary of the fate of Galileo down in Italy, who had been subject to the Inquisition for having challenged some authoritative teachings of the Church, Descartes might have been trying to be careful not to get in similar kinds of trouble in the course of trying to pursue his own ideas. And if you want to read some of the writings that Descartes produced, that will help you understand some of the things we're talking about here in this course, deepen your knowledge. You will find online a website called Early Modern Texts. I'll also be posting a URL for you on the course website. And Jonathan Bennett, the distinguished philosopher, has translated Descartes, as well as many other philosophers, into contemporary idiomatic English. And in the case in particular of Descartes, he has embellished the text a little bit in order to make it a bit more accessible to readers who are new to the material. So what is he about? What is his enterprise? What is he trying to accomplish? Well, Descartes had a number of aims in this long essay called The Meditations. He wanted to use reason as opposed to, for example, divine revelation in order to establish theism, or theism is the belief in the existence of God, usually defined in Western Judeo-Christian tradition as the being than which there can be no greater, and that's usually in turn defined as a being that has all possible perfections, such as omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, etc. So any perfection that God has, that God might be thought to have, God in fact has by that definition. And Descartes wanted to argue for theism in that sense, that a God so defined does in fact exist. And Descartes, just as importantly, wanted to establish a new foundation for the sciences. The science of his day that he found that he was raised in his early education was heavily influenced by scholastic philosophy, which was in turn heavily influenced by Aristotelian science. And although there is a great deal to be said for Aristotelian science, it tended to, so to speak, posit a level of mindedness, animacy in what we now think of as inanimate objects. So to put the thought very simply, in Aristotelian and thereby scholastic science, it was not uncommon to explain why, for example, a rock fell towards the surface of the earth when thrown up into the air on the basis of the hypothesis that the rock had a kind of, the term was conatus, something like an implicit, unexpressed desire to end up at what it took to be the center of the universe. Descartes thought that was positing a level of mindedness in what he thought was an otherwise mindless nature. And he wanted to come up with a more rigorous scientific explanation of natural phenomena. And as we just saw a moment ago, the developer himself of a powerful new set of mathematical tools, he wanted to, as we now describe it, mathematize nature as much as possible, to explain how it is that things happen in the world outside of our minds in a way that can be clearly and rigorously expressed in mathematical terms, and also explained by means of mathematically expressible laws. Descartes also wanted to prove that the mind's a distinct kind of substance from the body. He took it that the mind is not something that can be fully explained in purely physical terms, and he gives an argument for that we'll see in just a moment. And part of Descartes' method will be to demand that as much as possible our minds, in the course of inquiry into ourselves and the world around us, be free from prejudices and withdrawn as much as possible from association with the senses. And in the course of arguing for this position, Descartes is going to be championing what he thinks of, what we now think of as an alternative to empiricism, namely rationalism. Whereas empiricism is the view that all knowledge comes from and only from the senses, rationalism is a view that opposes that, and while it's not always clearly and precisely defined, roughly speaking, rationalism is going to be, for our purposes, the doctrine that proper use of our reasoning faculties will give us the information that we need about our nature, about what is right and what is wrong, about mathematics, about the world around us, and perhaps even, and hopefully as well, even about God. And as I mentioned, rationalism's ancient rival is empiricism. And you can, when you first hear empiricism, you will probably find that it seems obvious, that it seems it's hard to deny that all knowledge comes from and only from experience. But if you reflect more on empiricism, you might begin to have some questions. For example, we take it that there are two kinds of knowledge, roughly speaking. One kind of knowledge is a posteriori, that knowledge that's got from experience, but there seems to be other kinds of knowledge that we might think of as a priori, prior to experience. So think about your belief, which in some cases you might also consider to be a case of knowledge, that, for example, certain mathematical claims are true, that 2 + 2 is 4, that the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. Those are things that I doubt you'll be able to verify, to establish by empirical means. It's not clear what tests you could undertake to determine conclusively that 2 + 2 is 4, or that the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. Claims of mathematics seem very secure, very certain, but they don't look like the things that we can know by means of empirical investigation. The empiricist owes us an answer to how it is we know such things. That's one kind of case. Another kind of case that seems to be a at least prima facie challenge to empiricism is the confidence that we seem to have. Many of us take ourselves to know that there are certain things that are right, other things that are wrong. Think about various forms of behavior that you feel sure are absolutely immoral, and other forms of behavior that you feel sure are absolutely moral. For example, for the former case, absolutely immoral, taking pleasure in torturing a small child, for example. Most of us will feel not just that it's a matter of opinion that such a thing is wrong, but that we feel sure that that's just a fact. Now, insofar as we think that, we take ourselves to know, probably, that such behavior is wrong. But what empirical investigation could establish that? What empirical inquiry could determine that such a thing is immoral? After all, there are plenty of cases in which we cause young children pain, for example, when we give them shots to vaccinate them, that we don't take to be wrong, don't take to be immoral. So just the sheer fact that we're causing someone pain doesn't make it wrong. What is it about, for example, torturing a child for your entertainment does feel wrong, something it seems that we know. But can we explain that? And if we can't explain that, it's not clear how we could explain it in empirical terms. The rationalist wants to come back with an explanation of those kinds of knowledge, and then will in turn try to generalize the method to account for, in a sense, how it is that we need to use our rational faculties to get even knowledge of the external world, that a posteriori knowledge that I mentioned a moment ago. Among other famous philosophers who were rationalists besides Descartes were Spinoza, Leibniz, and Malebranche. Rationalists emphasize the use of reason, but few would deny that we get anything at all from the senses. The issue is rather what the senses provide. Do the senses provide information of a sort that can be turned straight away into knowledge? Or is what the senses provide more like the way in which food provides calories, which indirectly enable us to think and indirectly enables us to produce knowledge, but there's no direct link between caloric intake and knowledge. And so too the rationalists might want to say there's no direct route between sensory experience and knowledge as well. You can find roots of rationalism in Socrates himself, who we discussed in our last lecture. So, for example, in the dialogue known as the Meno, Socrates uses what we referred to recently as Socratic method, asking someone questions without telling them anything, but in the process getting them to come to a realization on their own. In the Meno, Socrates has a discussion with his friend Minos, one of his slaves, a boy, and gets the boy to see, without, Socrates claims, any suggestions or any statements or any implicit leading of the questions that he asks him, gets the boy to see the truth of a geometrical theorem. And Socrates says, this boy came to see that a certain theorem in geometry is true, but I didn't tell him anything. And furthermore, it's not likely that he learned this theorem of geometry on his own in the course of his 10 years on this earth as a slave on Minos' estate. So Socrates infers he must have had it in him already. It must have been innate inside of him. Socrates suggests, therefore, that the Minos slave boy, and generalizes it to the rest of us, must have had a soul that preexisted the embodiment of that soul in our physical body, firstly. And secondly, that soul must have been something in which there is some kind of reservoir of information, if not actually knowledge, then what Socrates will refer to as true opinion. In the Phaedo, another dialogue that is the description of the very last moments of Socrates before he actually drank the hemlock, Socrates tells his friends that death is the separation of the soul from the body, and makes the surprising claim that what the philosopher does for most of his or her life is freeing the soul from association with body as much as possible. And he says at one point, and indeed the soul reasons best when none of the senses troubles it. Neither hearing nor sight, nor pain nor pleasure, but when it is most by itself, taking leave of the body, and as far as possible having no contact or association with it in its search for reality. So Socrates suggests that there's a sense in which thinking is done, can be done, and probably will be done best when you detach yourself from sensory experience and think on your own, and if at all possible, do so in a way that is completely separated from your physical being. In that respect, you will be engaging in thinking at its best. You'll be most likely to acquire knowledge, but doing so requires pushing away sensory experience. This point of view, therefore, is Socrates' way of expressing a rationalist position that will be dormant for some centuries and then come to resurface in the work of Descartes. Here's a question for you before I move on to plunging into some of Descartes' texts. Most of us, first of all, take ourselves to persist through time. We're going to see at the end of this course that there are some philosophers who challenge that idea. But common sense, at least in much of the Western tradition and probably many other traditions as well, take ourselves to be able to say, hey, there's a picture that I've got, or one of my parents has, of me standing on the street corner, and I just dropped an ice cream cone onto the street, and there it is melting on the sidewalk near my feet. And you can say, that's me. That was the earlier version of myself. How do I know that's me? Well, first of all, I've got all my family members, and I've got the photograph. But also, you might say, I can remember that experience. I remember how it was funny and I was frustrated at the same time. That is to say, many of us can make very confident judgments of the idea of what philosophers refer to as personal identity over time. That is, there's a self that existed at some previous time. And here's a self right here in front of you, or there's yourself there in front of you. And you can say there's an earlier stage, so to speak, that I can say that's an earlier stage of me. That was me standing on the street corner. That was me learning how to ride a bicycle for the first time. That was me running in a pack of kids having fun as we made our way to the shoreline, for example. Insofar as you can do that, you can take seriously the idea that you, this very self, persists through time, even though you change, even though you go from being shorter to taller, you get a haircut, you maybe dye your hair, you get some piercings or some tattoos, you change in various ways, but you can still say the same self persists, and we can see the source of that by saying, okay, I'm the one who got that piercing, I'm the one who got those tattoos, I'm the one who was running to the shoreline with my friends. And so as we can make sense of that, we can make sense for my purposes, for our purposes, of the idea of persisting through time. First point. Second point, I want you to ask yourself, does it seem possible to you, in principle, I'm not asking you to say this definitely will happen, but I want you to ask yourself whether this could happen, that, I hope this doesn't, but suppose that you get in a terrible, for example, accident, car accident, bicycle accident. Does it seem possible to you that in spite of that terrible tragedy, you, the self that is you, could survive that experience? Of course, many theistic traditions will say that there will be a soul that survives an experience of the destruction of your body. But even if you're not a theist, my question is just, do you think that that kind of thing is possible? Do you think that it could happen, that you could survive the destruction of your body? I ask my students in the beginning of the semester to raise their hands if they think this kind of thing is possible, even if they're not theists, even if they're not sure it will happen. Just ask whether that's a conceivable outcome. And most of them raise their hands and say, yes, I think it's possible. For now, that's all I need you to do, is to make an honest judgment with yourself about whether you think that's possible, and write it down somewhere. I can't tell whether or not it's something that you vote on either positively or negatively, but I can ask you to tell yourself and be honest about it for later on. So remember that an affirmative answer to this question does not require that you be a theist. You only need to think that it's a possibility, and we'll come back to the point in not too long. Now, as we talk about Descartes' Meditations, it's a book that's broken up into 6 meditations, each of which is fairly short. But don't be deceived by that, because the writing in each case is fairly compact. There's a lot packed into just about every line. So don't be afraid, don't be bothered, don't be put off if you find that as you read through it, in, for example, the early modern texts version on that website that I mentioned to you, if you read through some of those passages, you might find, well, I see the words, I see the sentences, but there's a lot that seems to be going over my head. Don't be put off by that. That happens to everybody who reads Descartes for the first or second or even sometimes the third time. Every time I read Descartes, I find something else that I didn't notice before. So there's a lot of depth in the writing, and it will repay careful scrutiny. But in the very first meditation, Descartes refers to what he calls the false opinions of his youth. And what he's meaning there, it seems to me, is that he can look back on times when he was in school, maybe age 10 or 12, that he took certain things to be obviously true, and so obvious to be not even worth mentioning, but that later on he's now come to be skeptical about. So suppose that you were raised in an environment in which the traditional theory of the role of the Earth in the universe was that the Earth was the center of the universe, the so-called geocentric theory deriving from the ancient astronomer Ptolemy. Then suppose that in the course of your education, you hear about this guy, Copernicus, who's been going around saying that actually that's not true. The evidence suggests otherwise. There's evidence that the Earth actually, there's better evidence that the Earth revolves around the sun, the so-called heliocentric theory. Suppose that by the time you're 25, the heliocentric theory has now been widely accepted, and it's one that you think is true as well. Now you can look back on that experience and say, boy, when I was little, There are some beliefs that I took to be self-evident, and it seems justified by the senses, because I don't feel that, for example, as I stand here on the earth, it's moving in any sense. I don't feel like I'm revolving around anything. But now the scientific evidence suggests otherwise, highly contrary to common sense. Descartes says, well, given that experience, I can begin to wonder what else might be up for reconsideration. What other of the things that I now take to be self-evident I could end up finding 10 or 15 or 20 years from now to have been mistaken. Maybe what I should do if I'm going to engage in this project of trying to find a new foundation for the sciences, try to see how much I can question, how much I can doubt. He says, I want to raise everything to the ground and begin again from the original foundations in order to establish anything firm and lasting in the sciences. And he's going to engage in this enterprise after having been bothered by this question for much of his young adult life. As a young adult, he had been a bit of a soldier of fortune. Descartes had been a mercenary, had done a lot of traveling, a lot of gambling and dueling, but he had been nagged by these intellectual questions for a long time. Finally, he says, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to get comfortable, build a little fire in my wood stove, put on my dressing gown, get out some paper and my quill pen, and see if I can't write some of this out in such a way as to make sense of it. And he says, at last I will apply myself earnestly and unreservedly to this general demolition of my opinions. When he talks about the general demolition of his opinions, that's not as masochistic as it might sound. What he has in mind is to say, I want to stand back as much as possible from the opinions that I take to be true, even those that I take to be self-evident, and ask myself, which ones of those can I be certain about? Which ones of those can I take myself really to know? And his first point is that, in fact, our senses often deceive us in one form or another. You might have been driving through the desert one day and found that up ahead it looked like there was water on the road. But in fact, as you got closer, that water disappeared. But then you might have realized that it was not water, but a mirage created by the heat. You've seen Muller-Lyer lines, you've seen various other optical illusions that people can create that will make you think one line is longer than the other, even though it's not. A man standing in what seems like the back of a room is very tall and bigger than somebody in front of him, or vice versa. Optical illusions famously will deceive our senses and can trick people. In addition to that, there are hallucinations. You might be falling asleep. You might be under the influence of some kind of controlled substance. You might be, for example, having a bout with extreme sleep deprivation, and you might experience some hallucinations in which, for example, you hear voices, or you seem to see somebody moving in a mirror that you're looking at. You turn around and nothing's there, but you might wonder, maybe I saw something, maybe not. Was it a trick of the light? Was it something coming from my mind? In some cases, we might be deceived into thinking something that's there that is not. And even there are cases of dreams in which we find ourselves deceived. You probably have been in an experience in which you were falling asleep and you had the experience of falling and you shook yourself awake just for a moment before falling back asleep again. Maybe at that time you believed that you were falling. Likewise, you might have had a roommate or a friend who was in the same room with you as you were sleeping, and that as you woke up, the person says, hey, you yelled out somebody's name, or said you were screaming, saying, "Stop me! I'm being chased by some hipsters, and they're trying to throw me into a vat of kombucha or something." You might say, your friend might say, "Gosh, you must have some paranoia or something about hipsters. You must have believed, at least at the time that it was happening, that you were in danger of being thrown into a vat of kombucha." So the idea is that in dreams, it seems like we're able to have beliefs that are not true, but at the time they seem perfectly real to us. It seems as if that's exactly how things are happening. Descartes then imagines the following possibility. How do I know that I'm not dreaming right now? I seem to be sitting in a dressing gown in front of a pot-bellied stove in which there's a nice warm fire going. I've got my parchment and I've got my quill pen and I'm trying to do some writing. But I've had dreams like this before. Maybe I'm having a dream right now in which I'm just having a vivid experience of doing the things that I think I am, but in fact I'm lying in a bed somewhere snoring away. Descartes says, I'm not sure I know how to rule that out. He does make one point, which is a bit of a sort of suggestion. He kind of tips his hand a little bit in order to show the reader where he's going. He mentions that even in dreams, Those dreams need what he refers to as raw materials. For example, the idea of extension, how big an object is, shape, quantity, size, number, and location. And he suggests that those are the ideas that will end up having some role to play in the positive story that he wants to give of the nature of knowledge. But he says, at this point, I can't be sure. I'm just going to sort of suggest the direction we might be going, but we still have to earn our right to get there. But it seems on the face of it that things like geometry and arithmetic are more certain than, for example, astronomy and medicine, because geometry and arithmetic seem like they're things that I can do in the privacy of my own thoughts in this a priori way that we mentioned before, whereas, for example, even though astronomy and medicine seem like they're sciences, they still require some claims about the world outside of our minds, and maybe those claims can be mistaken if we're being deceived in some way by virtue of hallucinations, something of the kind. To take Descartes' skepticism in a more contemporary form, consider the following hypothesis. Imagine this guy, let's call him Zeke, a neuroscience graduate student who is nevertheless one of the world's leading experts on how to stimulate somebody's brain in such a way as to produce experiences. So now suppose that one night under the cover of darkness, he and a couple of associates sneak into a dorm room or apartment building where you're sleeping, and they etherize the room in such a way as to cause you to go unconscious, and they pull your body out, still under cover of darkness, sneak you back into the underground lab where Zeke has all of his gizmos, and they carefully, painstakingly remove your brain and parts of your central nervous system from your body, and then put it in a vat of electrochemical conducing fluid, causing it to float there. And now what Zeke and his associates are able to do is send signals through that fluid, electrochemical signals through that fluid in such a way as to stimulate your neurons in various ways. And Zeke's been following you around, so his cronies, they've been following you around so that they know what your schedule's like, they know who you send messages to via text, they know who you get phone calls from, they know what types of shows you like to watch on your computer or on TV, what YouTube channels you subscribe to, etc., etc. They know what your daily routine is more or less like, so that when 7:15 comes in the morning comes by, that's when you normally wake up. They, instead of you're lying in bed being woken up by your alarm clock because you're not in bed anymore, they say, okay, now it's time to stimulate this person with the experience of being bothered by an alarm clock. And now 7:22, the experience of rolling out of bed and putting on some slippers. 7:27, the experience going downstairs to their kitchen or the dorm cafeteria, whatever it is, getting some food. And likewise, they simulate experiences throughout your day that were just like the ones that you would normally have in the course of a typical day of your life. They might even simulate experiences of you're sitting in a library reading a book of philosophy. They could do that. After all, if your brain is just something that produces electrochemical stimuli in such a way as to make you have thoughts, make you have experiences, then perhaps that's something that at least is in principle possible, even if right now we don't have all of the technology that we need to do that. But if it's in principle possible, then Descartes wants you to ask yourself, how do I know that that's not happening to me right now? How do I know that last night in my sleep, Zeke and his friends, or some local analog of them, didn't sneak into the place where I was sleeping, etherize me, knock me out, and then drag my body out of where I was, take it down to the lab, remove the brain from my body, etc. And now here I am. I think that, you might say to yourself, I think that I'm sitting in a library or a cafe with my tablet or laptop watching a lecture on philosophy. But maybe what's happening is that I'm having my brain stimulated by Zeke and his cronies in such a way as to make me to think that I'm having that experience. But in fact, it doesn't represent anything outside of my mind. What can you do to rule that out? You might say, well, I can pinch myself, or I can even take a knife and cut myself, make myself bleed a little bit. I'm not suggesting that you do that, but you might think that that's a possibility. But then if you reflect on it, notice that Zeke could make you have that experience as well. That is to say, Descartes will point out that there's nothing right now, at least he can think of, that you could do to determine conclusively that you're not in that brain in a vat type of experience. Nothing you can do to show yourself conclusively that that's not what's going on. But if you can't rule that possibility out, then how can you say that you know that you are sitting in a chair at a library or a cafe or on your couch at home or wherever you might happen to think that you are? Any experience you have right now seems to be consistent with the possibility that your brain and central nervous system are floating in Zeke's vat, being stimulated in various ways by his electrochemical impulses. Even though you feel sure that that hypothesis is not true, Descartes might say, maybe that's just a prejudice on your part that you need to give up if we're going to have any chance of providing a new foundation for the sciences and getting what we take to be knowledge to be genuine knowledge and not just seeming knowledge, not just apparent knowledge. Those of you who've seen the movie, one of the series of the Matrix movies, will now realize that the screenwriters of that movie just basically went to the philosophy library and stole a lot of Descartes' ideas in order to make the movies. I'm not taking anything away from the quality of the movies, but the idea is there. The idea that you, for all you know, could be a being that spends all of its time inside of an energy-producing pod, producing energy for malevolent machines, is just a takeoff on the original Cartesian idea of what we now refer to as radical skepticism. So Descartes wants to say that right now I'm not sure that I don't know that I can be certain of anything. He writes, whether I'm asleep or awake, maybe it's true that 2 and 3 make 5 and a square doesn't have more than 4 sides. It doesn't seem possible that such obvious truths should be subject to the suspicion of being false. But on the other hand, I do judge that sometimes others make mistakes in matters they believe they know most perfectly. How do I know that I'm not, in a similar fashion, being deceived every time I add 2 and 3 or count the sides of a square? So by the end of meditation 1, Descartes says, I sometimes find for a moment that I feel that I know something about what's going on with myself, but maybe that's kind of like a prisoner who enjoyed an imaginary freedom during his sleep. Somebody who's in prison who has a dream which he's running free and unshackled through a field of flowers. But then I wake up from that dream and realize that no, I'm still stuck in this cell. Descartes says, well, yes, given that perhaps depressing realization, maybe I've got to admit that the possibility that nothing is certain. Maybe I just have to think of myself as being in a whirlpool in which I have no ideas as to how to go up or how to go down. Maybe I've got to give up all my knowledge, and now I'm at a loss to figure out how to get back any. So we've got to the end of meditation 1, in which Descartes raises this radical, what we now refer to as radical skepticism. He suggests maybe I can't know anything at all. Maybe I can't be certain of anything. But then he notices that even if I did persuade myself of something, I had to have existed if I did that. That is to say, he writes, I exist. That's necessarily true every time that I utter it or conceive it in my mind. And that is the basis of one of the more famous arguments in the Western philosophical tradition, what we now refer to as the cogito argument, where cogito is Latin for I am thinking. So here's an argument, premise 1, I am thinking. Even if I'm being deceived by Zeke, even if Zeke is producing electrochemical stimulation for my brain, I'm still having thoughts. I'm not mistaken in thinking that I'm having thoughts. So that's the first premise. Second premise, I couldn't be thinking unless there were a self there to do the thinking. And I'm not making any substantial assumptions about what that self would have to be, but there must be some kind of self. There's no such thing as just free-floating thought. Thought must always belong to a mind of some kind. So premise 1, I'm thinking. Premise 2, I couldn't be thinking unless there were a self doing the thinking. Therefore, there is a self doing some thinking. That is to say, I exist. So the full formulation in Latin of the argument is referred to as cogito ergo sum. I'm thinking, therefore I exist, is Descartes' way of saying, look, at least one thing I can know, I can be certain of, that I exist. How to know that I exist? Well, even on the most depressing, skeptical scenario, even if I'm in Zeke's vat or being deceived by what Descartes refers to as an evil genius, still, there must be a self that is there to be deceived. And therefore, I can be certain at least of one thing, namely, that I exist. This is what Descartes refers to as an Archimedean point, where Archimedes was an ancient scientist who said, if you give me one unmovable point and a long enough lever, a long enough stick, and one that won't break, I can move the entire earth. So too, Descartes says, I'm going to start out with this Archimedean point, that idea that I exist. I can be certain of that. And then look around and ask, is there anything I can build on the basis of that simple observation so that we can begin to reconstruct our knowledge on a firm foundation? Well, he asks then, what kind of being am I? He answers, a thing that thinks. What is that? He answers, a thing that doubts and understands and affirms and denies and wills, refuses, and that also imagines and senses. Descartes takes all these to be, as it were, activities of his mind. And his point is that, for example, when I'm doubting, There too, I can be sure that what's going on is that I'm doubting. When I'm affirming, when I say that proposition, I think it's true. Even if I'm wrong in thinking that it's true, I can be right in my judgment that I'm making that judgment, that affirmation. Likewise, if I make up my mind to do something, suppose I will to raise my hand, even if I'm not sure if the hand goes up, although I have the experience of its doing so, I can still, Descartes says, be sure that I am willing, that I'm forming the intention to do something. So it's I who doubt, who understand and will. It's the same I who senses or is cognizant of bodily things as if through the senses. But he notices that this sensory experience might or might not correspond to anything outside of his own mind. But he still wants to say, it seems to me as if something is going on. I'm having what appears to be sensory experience. So think about the difference between, for example, I'm holding an apple in my hand, and it seems to me as if I'm holding an apple in my hand. I can't be sure, at least at this point of the meditations, Descartes will say, that I am holding an apple in my hand. Maybe I don't even have any hands. But I can still be sure that it seems to me as if that's what's going on. This, what we now refer to as second-order judgment, judgments about my own experiences. Those second-order judgments can be things of which I'm sure, that I can be sure, even if I can't be sure that those first-order judgments, such as I have an apple in my hand, are themselves true. Those second-order beliefs are things that I also think are indubitable. So what do we have? We can be sure that we exist, and we can also be sure of the truth of these second-order beliefs and just think it through. Even if you're in Zeke's vat, you have no way of proving at this point that you're not. Still, you're having an experience of, for example, it seems to you as if you're sitting in a chair watching a lecture on your laptop. And Descartes will say, you can be sure that that is how things seem. Descartes generalizes this point and also moves further towards his view about how proper progress in the science is going to have to go when he considers a piece of wax. And he says, think about this piece of wax. It's just been taken from the honeycomb. It still tastes of honey and has a scent of flowers from which the honey was gathered. Its color, shape, and size are all plain to see. It's hard, cold, and can be handled easily. If you rap it with your knuckle, it makes a sound. In short, it has everything that seems to be needed for a body to be known perfectly clearly. That is, it seems as I hold the wax here in my hand, I know it as well as I could possibly want to. But as I speak these words, I hold the wax near to the fire. And look, the taste and smell vanish. The color changes. The shape is lost. The size increases. The wax becomes liquid and hot. You can hardly even touch it. And it no longer makes a sound when you strike it. You just get this goop that sticks to your knuckle or something. But it's still the same wax. So what was it about the wax that I understood so clearly? I certainly had a clear mental grasp of the thing, so to speak. Evidently, it was not any one of the features that the senses told me of. For all of them, brought to me through taste and smell and touch and hearing, they've all now altered, yet it's still the same wax that I had before. So Descartes wants to suggest now that there's a sense in which I perceive more with my mind than with my senses. Sensory experience is like caloric intake. I need some of it in order to think, but thinking proper doesn't happen until I, so to speak, see through, peer through these sensory experiences of the sense of yellow or the sweet smell and say those aren't properties in the wax itself. The wax could lose those properties and still persist, he argues. And yet I'm able to grasp the wax with my mind. How do I do that, he says? He refers to what we now call the notion of primary qualities. Qualities that are mathematically definable, such as extension, location, space and time, number, mass, velocity of motion, and the like, the stuff of physical description. If there are any objects outside of my mind that exist, then insofar as I know them, I will know them by virtue of those types of properties, those types of primary qualities. Whereas describing something as being yellow or fragrant, soft, hard, as the case may be, is not a description of the thing itself, but rather what we now refer to as a secondary quality and a capacity for the thing to produce an experience in me, and in a way that does not objectively correspond to how things are, so to speak, in themselves. So then, if there is any wax out there, if there are any objects external to my mind, then insofar as I know them, it's by means of this mathematically expressible description. I need to be able to give it in rigorous mathematical terms. Otherwise, what I'll take to be knowledge will not be genuine knowledge. It'll be more my imposition of my own experiential connection with the world than objective scientific knowledge. So by the end of meditation 2, Descartes takes himself to know a few things now. First of all, that he exists. Secondly, how things seem to him to be. Those are the second-order thoughts, second-order judgments. Third, what kind of being he is. That's the passage that we quoted talking about what then am I, a thing that thinks and wills and understands, etc. And likewise, and finally, what properties external objects would have to have if there are any there to be known. And those properties, those primary qualities, have to do with extension, number, location, direction and velocity of movement, etc. Descartes puts that conditionally: if there are any things external to my mind, and if I know them, they would have to be known by means of those sorts of properties. So by the end of the second meditation, Descartes has begun to use that Archimedean point in order to establish some things that go beyond the sheer existence of his own self. In the third meditation, which is tough going, difficult reading, I don't expect you to be able to get to the bottom of all of it. I don't think that I have yet. He gives his first version of an argument for the existence of God. And scholars, so far as I know, take this to be what's now referred to as an unusual version of the cosmological argument. A cosmological argument for God's existence tries to show that by thinking about causality, the origins of things, where things could have come from, you can infer that there must have been a God that produced the things that we have in front of us. The most common form of the cosmological argument focuses on the existence of the physical world and says the physical universe must have come from somewhere, and it couldn't have come from just other physical things. Therefore, there must be something non-physical, perhaps something divine, that accounts for the existence of the physical universe. That's an interesting argument that I don't want to go into any depth about. But Descartes' version of that argument is not about the physical universe, but about something that he finds within himself, because he's introspecting. As we've seen, he finds that he can see close up, so to speak, know for sure that he's existing, that he's having thoughts, that he's performing judgments and willing to do certain things. He finds that these second-order thoughts are things that he can be sure of the existence of. But he also finds that himself, in the third meditation, he says, I've got the idea of an infinite substance, a thing that is infinitely powerful and has other kinds of perfections. And I don't think that I could have created that idea myself. I don't think I could have come up with something so sublimely wonderful as the idea of an infinite substance. And likewise, my parents gave that to me. I'm not sure they could have come up with it themselves. And their parents couldn't have come up with it themselves, etc. I think none of us human beings, none of us finite beings, he says, could have come up with the idea of an infinite substance. And so Descartes infers the only explanation that can make sense of the occurrence inside of my own mind of the idea of an infinite substance was that it was placed there by an infinite substance itself, namely God. That's kind of like the way in which a painter will sign her painting, put a little signature of herself in order to acknowledge the fact that she was the creator. So too, Descartes suggests, maybe I've got the idea of an infinite substance in the way in which God signed me as one of its products by saying, I'm the one who produced you. And Descartes' idea, we were not going to have to figure out whether he's got a valid or sound argument for this conclusion. For our purposes, it's going to be enough to just understand that by the end of the third meditation, he takes himself to have established the existence of God. So by now, he's got, by the end of the third meditation, that he exists, how things seem to him to be, even if he can't be sure that that's how things are. He can be sure about how things seem, what sort of being he is, the thing that thinks and wills and judges and denies and imagines, etc. What the properties of external objects would have to be if there are any external objects. That's the idea of primary qualities. And then the thing that's new as of the end of the third meditation is what he takes to be a proof of God's existence. We won't assess the cogency of that argument, but we'll just give it to Descartes in order to understand what he's going to be doing next, which is meditation 4. In meditation 4, to appreciate that, you need to understand a little bit about the problem of evil. The problem of evil is a traditional problem for theists. And theists have to worry about, and even if you're an agnostic, you might find yourself swayed in the direction of being an atheist as you look around you and you confront the amount of evil that there is in the world. Sometimes types of evil are called moral evil, where, for example, a person intentionally and knowingly does something that she takes to be wrong. The example of torturing a child that we mentioned not too long ago might be a case of that kind. There's also physical evils in which, for example, people die horrible deaths due to earthquakes and hurricanes and lightning strikes and diseases, that is, things that cause suffering that are not produced by the act of an intelligent, knowing agent. And there are other cases that are not so extreme or overt as what are defined as moral evil, in which, for example, a person fails to achieve a certain reasonable standard. They do not do their best. So, for example, someone who's got a talent that they choose because of laziness, can't be bothered, they decide not to develop that talent. You might feel it's a tragedy that they didn't develop their talent into becoming the great musician they could have been, or the great mathematician that they could have been, etc. Likewise, being in error is a form of evil for the following reason. Learning about the world, acquiring knowledge, is something that he wants to suggest is inherently good. And when you don't do your, what he'll call, epistemic best, when you're not using your mind in as rigorous and careful and painstaking way as you can, you're likely to fall into error. But when you're not using your mind in the most rigorous and painstaking way, that's your fault. You're not doing as well as you could do if you're not trying as hard as you might in order to, for example, when you're doing mathematics, calculate carefully without making any calculation mistakes. Or if you're investigating the world outside of you, trying to do some science, you might be using devices that are insufficiently clean or that are malfunctioning in some way that might give you incorrect results. The idea is that Descartes formulates what he calls the notion of clear and distinct perception. And when I engage in clear and distinct perception, I'm using my mind in the most rigorous, careful, painstaking, self-critical way that I can imagine before I jump to any conclusions. I only conclude something when I've challenged myself and imagined doubts that are as painful and surprising and distressing as I can possibly imagine. It's only if I've allayed those doubts, only if I've convinced myself that those doubts can be overcome, that I'm going to allow myself to come to that conclusion. I clearly and distinctly perceive a piece of wax, if there's any wax outside my mind, by virtue of only ascribing to it these primary qualities such as extension and shape and location in space and time. If I think of the wax as being yellow or fragrant or warm, Descartes will say, then I'm engaging in obscure and confused perception. I'm not thinking in as rigorous a way as I possibly can. So with that background, with that partly theistic background that Descartes has produced up until the end of Meditation 3. In Meditation 4, Descartes argues for, you can think of it as sort of a new principle of logic. In logic, we have inference rules. If certain things can be accepted as true, for example, the proposition that either A or B is true, and you also know that A is not true, you can infer that B must be true. And likewise, Descartes will say, if you can clearly and distinctly perceive that something is so, then you can infer that that thing is the case too. Why? Because if that proposition in question were not true, then if you were to conclude it, that is, accept it, it would be a case of you're falling into error. That is not your fault because you've done your epistemic best to figure out whether P is true or not, that proposition is true or not. Then it cannot be your fault, it can only be God's. But God's not a deceiver. God would not ever will anything evil to happen. Therefore, Descartes will say, if I can clearly and distinctly perceive something, then the theistic backing behind my epistemic processes will ensure that I come to a conclusion that is definitely the case, that is definitely true. So, for example, here's a clear example. You can clearly and distinctly perceive that there can be no largest integer. How could you know? Well, I can clearly think of some number n, and suppose somebody suggests that n, a very, very large number, is the largest integer that there is. But now I can see clearly, with my mind's eye, as it were, add 1. N plus 1 is clearly larger than n, and therefore n, the original n we started with, cannot be the largest integer. I've used the process known as reductio ad absurdum, to conclude that there can be no largest integer. We've just proven that there can be no largest integer. Anything you thought was largest integer is one such that you could add 1 to it and get one that's even larger. Therefore, Descartes will say, I've used my mind in a rigorous and painstaking way. I can conclude that there's no largest integer. There are infinitely many integers. God would not let me fall into error, given that I've used my mind in the careful, rigorous, and painstaking way that I just did. Another example. Descartes thinks that you can clearly and distinctly perceive the possibility of your existing disembodied. And I asked you to think about this a little while ago. Before we were deeply into the middle of Descartes' reasoning, I asked you to imagine, well, if you were in a terrible accident that caused the death of your body, whether it's conceivable that you could survive the destruction of that body. I'm guessing that many people watching me raise that question thought, yeah, I guess that's conceivable. That seems like a possibility. Descartes will say, well, if that's the case, then you've got the following possibility. The following is a possibility that you could exist disembodied, that could happen even if we don't ourselves know that it will happen. So let's back up a little bit and think about the more general question about the nature of the mind and its relation to the body. One question is this: could thinking, feeling, sensing, and the like be purely physical processes in the way that metabolizing and digesting and sweating seem to be purely physical processes? Well, if the answer is no, if thinking, feeling, sensing, etc. are not purely physical processes, we might ask, how can these mental events bring about physical changes in the world? And how can physical changes bring about mental events? Sometimes it seems like I can make a decision to raise my hand and whoop, there goes my hand, it goes up. Other cases are ones in which something sharp slices against my leg and I feel an experience of pain. In the first case, we've got a mental event bringing about a physical event. In the second case, we've got a physical event bringing about a mental event. But how can those things happen if mental events are not physical processes at all? On the other hand, if thinking, feeling, sensing, and the like are purely physical processes, how can we make sense of the possibility that many of us just acknowledged of surviving the destruction of my body? How could a purely physical theory make sense of the idea that I could persist after my body is wholly destroyed? This is sometimes referred to as the mind-body problem. What kind of thing is a mind? Is it a purely physical or a non-physical thing? Either answer seems like it's going to raise some difficulties. But let's try to get a better sense of where Descartes is coming from. One background assumption that he wants you to make that seems pretty reasonable is what's known as the indiscernibility of identicals. It's simple, it goes as follows. If X and Y are identical, Sam Clemens and Mark Twain, or the morning star and the evening star, or 3 squared and the number 9, those are all cases of identities. If X and Y are identical, then any property that X has, Y has as well, and vice versa. So if, for example, Venus is the same thing as the morning star, and Venus, the planet, has a certain mass, then the morning star, that same planet, has that same mass as well, and vice versa. Don't confuse the indiscernibility of identicals with the identity of indiscernibles, which is a different, distinct, non-equivalent, and much more controversial claim in philosophy. So the indiscernibility of identicals. Likewise, I want you to think about the notion of a modal property. In addition to properties like being rectangular, or weighing 43 kilos, being made of sodium, we're also familiar with properties like being capable of running a mile in 8 minutes, being capable of eating 5 pizzas in 1 hour. Those are what we refer to as modal properties, which you can have even if you're not eating anything or not running it right now. You're sitting on the couch relaxing, perhaps, but you still have the modal property of being able to do perhaps one of those things. Now, here's an argument. Descartes will hope that you'll find each of these premises self-evident, that is, so obvious as to not be worth denying, and then he's going to try to convince you of the conclusion as something that just follows logically from the premises. Premise 1, I clearly and distinctly perceive the following possibility, that I could exist without my body. And as I suggested, many of you probably accepted that already, and clear and distinct perception just involves imagining that possibility, thinking it through carefully, not seeing any internal contradiction or incoherence in it. It's not clear what that would be in the case of disembodied existence, and then saying, okay, so it seems like that's something I clearly and distinctly perceive as being possible. But if that is possible, then it seems like it's also the case that I could exist without my body. So this very self, or we could put it as my mind, has the modal property of being capable of existing without my body. But notice my body does not have the property of being capable of existing without my body. But imagine body and mind are X and Y. We've got X having a certain modal property that Y does not have. Therefore, X and Y can't be identical, because if they were identical, they'd have to have all the same properties by the indiscernibility of identicals. Therefore, Descartes will infer that my mind and body are distinct. And notice that this argument can be reformulated to refer not just to your body in the gross sense of everything except for your central nervous system. It can be reformulated to even include your central nervous system. In fact, it can be reformulated to refer to any physical substance at all. So if this argument is a sound argument, it's going to show that your mind is not identical with anything physical, be it your whole body, including your central nervous system, or your central nervous system detached from your body, or your cerebral cortex, or your prefrontal cortex, or any part of your brain, nothing there will be identical with your mind. Many people refer to the conclusion of what's now called the body detachment argument as showing that mind and body are distinct. But that's too weak, because after all, my left hand and my right hand are distinct. But that's not going to give me any conclusion about somehow the physical world not being a complete, not containing everything that exists. If Descartes' right, the physical world does not contain everything that exists. There exist things that go beyond the physical, namely minds. But that's a more radical claim than just the claim that mind and body are distinct. A better formulation of this dualistic picture is one according to which my mind is not identical with anything physical. It's distinct in that very dramatic sense. Notice also that, although Descartes' formulation of this so-called body detachment argument depends upon the theistic premise that refers to clear and distinct perception, we can reformulate it in modern terms that don't require theism, don't require Descartes' particular take on the problem of evil in the following way. Premise 1, it's possible for me to exist without my body. Many of you probably acknowledge that is true. 2, I could therefore, that is, I've got the modal property of being capable of existing without my body. My mind thus has that modal property. My body does not have it. Therefore, once again, mind and body are distinct. So that my mind is not, even from this non-theistic formulation of the argument, we get the conclusion that my mind is not identical with any physical substance whatsoever. And that is a radical conclusion. And notice also that it's a conclusion that follows from pretty uncontroversial premises, and not very many of them. We're going to see that many subsequent philosophers denied the dualistic conclusion, denied that mind is distinct from the body, asserted something more like a materialistic claim that everything, including the mind, is a purely physical process or material object, without explaining where Descartes' argument goes wrong, without explaining what the fallacy, if any, is in it. It's only when we can find out where Descartes' argument goes wrong that we will have good grounds for setting our faces against that dualistic conclusion and proceeding in perhaps a more materialistic path. So we've considered two different versions of the body detachment argument, both of which yield the conclusion that the mind is distinct from the body. And I want to just really emphasize that. That's not to say that the mind is distinct from the body in the mere sense in which your left hand is distinct from your right, but rather that your mind is different from anything physical at all. If that argument is a sound argument, that if it's cogent and proves its conclusion, then it's going to show that a physical description of the world is not going to be a complete description of everything that's in the world. It will leave some things out. What? Well, the minds. It'll be incomplete. So Descartes, while trying to give a new rigorization of science, trying to give a mathematization of scientific theorizing, at the same time is trying to say that that will be very important and very worthwhile if we can make it work, but it's never going to be complete. It'll always leave out the capacity of minds to do the things that they do. Descartes, in another place in the Sixth Meditation, gives a different kind of argument for the distinctness of mind and body, for the non-physicality of the mind. It's known as the divisibility argument. Premise 1, any piece of matter, he says, can be divided. And this is something that's a little bit controversial. It's not clear that subatomic particles can be divided, but for the sorts of matter he's able to think of and have experience with are things that he's going to say can be divided. Whereas, by contrast, many mental things cannot be divided in any sense. So, for example, suppose you've got an experience of pain in your left ankle. In what sense can that experience be divided into a left half or a right half, or a top or a bottom? That seems a kind of indivisible thing. But if that's right, then whereas matter has the modal property of being capable of being divided, mental events do not have the property of being capable of being divided. Therefore, they can't be identical. Therefore, that is to say, they're distinct in kind. So this is a different argument, perhaps not as impressive as the body detachment argument, because you can imagine someone raising questions about the idea that mental events cannot be divided at all. Likewise, you can imagine someone raising questions about the idea that all physical events can be divided. But be that as it may, for our purposes, what matters is just to notice that Descartes gives more than one argument for the distinctness of mind and body, and at least one of them has some cogency to it in such a way as to make us have to scratch our heads to think of where it might go wrong. That is, many of us take it as self-evident, or at least awfully plausible, given the recent developments in fields like neuroscience, that thinking is a phenomenon that occurs in the central nervous system. But just because we think that that's self-evident, that's not going to show us or explain to us where Descartes' argument or arguments go wrong. We'll have to dig a little bit deeper. I should also mention that by the end of the sixth meditation, Descartes looks back and says, well, I've given you the idea of clear and distinct perception. I've shown you what I take to be things that I can really establish. That is, that I have a mind, that I exist, what the contents of my mind are, second-order thoughts, the existence of God, the fact that I'm not identical, the self is not identical with anything physical. That's a fairly substantial number of things to have established with what it takes to be absolute certainty. But he also points out, he also at least remarks that, as he puts it, the hyperbolic doubts of the last few days ought to be rejected as ludicrous, including, he says, I can be sure, after all, that I'm not dreaming. How does he know this? Well, he says, dreams generally are incoherent. They're kind of illogical. They tend to not make any sense, whereas my normal waking life is not like that. My normal waking life is one that tends to have a fairly rational progression, tends to be intelligible. Therefore, I can be sure that I'm not dreaming. This is a remark that has left many commentators not quite satisfied. Many people have looked back on Descartes' meditations and said, well, I'm not sure that he succeeds in establishing the existence of God. I'm not sure, therefore, that a lot of his other argumentation is quite persuasive and quite completely cogent. And some people have gone so far as to argue that, in a sense, Descartes has let the skeptical genie out of the box. That is, if after raising this radical skepticism in the first couple of meditations, he's not quite able to completely overcome the radical doubts that he had raised. There's going to be at least some work to do to explain how all those radical doubts can be allayed, especially if you're not sure that you're convinced of the arguments for theism, the clear and distinct perception, related notions that flow from it. Another kind of meditative moment I'd like you to engage in with me is what I'm going to call bamboo breathing. And bamboo breathing is just a simple breathing technique that helps you calm yourself, focus your mind, think about something, nothing, again, transcendental or heavily spiritual or mystical, just getting you to monotask by focusing for a moment on your breathing. So this is called bamboo breathing because it's supposed to bring to mind the stalk of a bamboo tree in which you can imagine a stalk that has segments. Those segments should correspond to the way you breathe out, the way you exhale after taking a deep breath. So take a not hugely, but reasonably deep breath, and you'll breathe out segmentally. Maybe 4 out breaths before you want to fill up your lungs again. If we do that, say, 10 times, we'll find ourselves wanting to, I think, calm down, focus, relax, and let the mental waters become more serene. So let's take a deep breath. Bamboo, breathe out. Let's keep on doing that. Thank you. So if you're starting out with the question, what kinds of things are there? What kinds of things exist? Then there are 2 primary answers to that question, one of which is known as monism, The answer, namely, is one kind of thing, the other which is known as dualism. The answer, there are two kinds of things. Standardly, monism can take either one of two forms, the most popular being what's known as materialistic monism. That is, that everything that exists is matter or some force or property of matter. And if you're a materialist monist, you'll say even people are purely physical things. Even their thoughts are purely physical processes. You could also be a monist by holding that everything in a sense is mental. The only things that exist are in some sense ideas. That's a view we associate with the philosopher George Berkeley. Not something that we'll be trying to defend here or explain here, but there is a version of monism that says everything is, as it were, ideal as opposed to material. Whereas on the other side is the dualistic position, which says that there are two kinds of things, and a purely physical description of the universe will never be a complete description. If you're a dualist, you're going to have to worry about a couple of different questions. As I adumbrated before, common sense seems to show that as an everyday occurrence, mental events can bring about physical changes, and likewise in the other direction. But if you're a dualist, it's not quite clear how that interface is going to go. Descartes did a fair bit of vivisection, that is, operating on animals, not all of whom were dead at the time. He also did a lot of dissection of human corpses, and he found inside human brains what we now know to be a genuine part of the brain that's now referred to as the pineal gland. And he thought that maybe the pineal gland is the locus, the place at which mind and body interact. But claiming that mind and body interact at the pineal gland or any other place just raises all those old questions over again. How do those things interact? According to the principle of the causal closure of the physical, every physical event that has a cause, and we don't have to assume that every physical event does have a cause, but every physical event that does have a cause has a purely physical cause. That seems to be a pretty deep presupposition of modern physics, for example. But if you're a dualist, you're going to have to deny that. Because if you're a dualist, you're going to have to say that there are mental events that are not identical with any physical events that bring about physical changes. And that would seem to be a violation of the principle of the causal closure of the physical. So one consequence that should make a dualist scratch her head and wonder what's going on is the fact that the dualist seems to fly in the face of both the common sense fact that mind and body seem to interact and the fact that seems like it's a deep part of physics that the physical world is causally closed. They seem to have to run against those two, it seems, facts. And if they're not going to run against them, they'll have some explaining to do. Likewise, it seems like if you're a dualist, a mystery arises as to how it is we could know about somebody else's mind. If dualism is right, then we know about our own minds in an introspective way that seems to produce a high degree of confidence. But how do I know about what's happening in somebody else's mind? Common sense suggests that on an everyday basis, especially for those people that I have lots of interaction with, I can often know what's going on inside of their mind. I can tell by this person's furrowed brow that she's irritated. I can tell by that person's continuing to fidget with their hair that they're distracted or that they're angry. But if you're a dualist in the tradition of Descartes, that's going to be a mystery. And in particular, there's never going to be any way of finding out for sure what's going on in somebody's mind, because even if you were to open up their cranium and look inside their brain, you would never be able to get any conclusive evidence of what's happening with them mentally. Whereas if you're a materialist, you at least have hope that that sort of thing could be established beyond a shadow of a doubt. So those are not absolute refutations of dualism. They're things rather that raise questions for a dualistic position that a defender of that position is going to have to say more about to either explain them away, etc. Final point I want to make about Descartes and his project for now is the following. Whereas with Socrates and his interlocutors, we found that learning about oneself, knowing about oneself, had to do not just with knowledge, but to some extent also brought in the notion of wisdom. That is to say, being wise when we try to figure out what it means, what the Delphic oracle meant in saying that no one is wiser than Socrates, involved not just knowledge about oneself, but knowledge of one's limitations, one's ignorance, and thereby what we thought was what made that valuable and made Socrates to have a bit of an edge over many of his fellow Athenians was that by virtue of being aware of his limitations, he was more likely to be able to act wisely, not act foolishly, not hastily interpret things that the oracle said and thereby go into battle and have his empire destroyed, for example. Whereas Descartes says not very much about wisdom, at least in the writings that we've looked at, but mostly about knowledge. And we've also noticed that one can have a lot of knowledge without necessarily being wise. So there's not an obvious connection between Descartes' notion of self-knowledge and Socrates. Socrates gives us a notion that perhaps in some ways is more satisfying because it has to do with wisdom, not just knowledge. At the same time, however, Descartes gives us a method that he hopes will be rigorous as a way of helping us move out of our knowledge of ourselves to knowledge of the external world, in a way is bound up with the rigorization of modern mathematics and modern science, and also has a powerful argument that helps us answer the question, what is the relationship between the mind and the body? Either we're going to accept that with its consequent puzzles, or we'll have to find a way in which Descartes might have been mistaken, and that set of questions is what we'll move on to in our next lecture. Welcome back to Know Thyself on the Value and Limits of Self-Knowledge. This is our third class, which focuses on classical Western philosophical approaches to self-knowledge. Today I want to talk about Gilbert Ryle's recasting of the mind-body problem. So just reviewing where we've gone so far, what we've accomplished so far, we've talked about the Socratic approach to self-knowledge. According to that approach, we live and examine life by engaging in frequent dialogue about the most central issues: justice, piety, virtue, knowledge, etc. And it's hoped that this will yield some kind of wisdom and not just knowledge of many facts. Remember, knowing things and being wise seem to be very different kinds of achievements. By contrast, a Cartesian approach to self-knowledge is going to be part of a system for developing a new and rigorous science. We emphasize knowledge of our mental states as a first step toward true scientia, the Latin for rigorous science. Wisdom has no special place here in Descartes' discussion, at least of the parts of Descartes that we've looked at. Though Descartes does emphasize the importance of using one's mind carefully and avoiding obscure and confused ideas as we reach our conclusions, so clear and distinct perception puts heavy weight on the idea of being careful and not falling into the temptations that our mind is prone to, such as, for example, ascribing what we now know to be secondary qualities to objects outside of our minds, thinking just in terms of primary qualities. Both philosophers, Socrates and Descartes, emphasize their own limitations and exhort others to be mindful of their own. Both put forward propositional knowledge as the sort of gold standard of intellectual achievement. And as we recall from Socrates' discussion of his interaction with the craftsman when he tried to figure out whether anybody was wiser than he ended up not taking their knowledge their abilities as being especially important in understanding the degree of their wisdom. And both Socrates and Descartes see the mind as distinct from the body, which tends, according to them, to distract and corrupt thought, as opposed to supporting it or enhancing it or making it more sophisticated. We're going to be moving gradually towards contemporary thinkers that want to challenge many of those assumptions, put in place different ways of understanding knowledge, including self-knowledge. One of those, who's very important in the development of contemporary philosophy in the Western English-speaking tradition, is Gilbert Ryle, and I want to talk today primarily about his book known as The Concept of Mind. Ryle's dates were 1900 to 1976. He was a philosopher of ordinary language, and that means that he wanted to start out with common sense as, if not the last word, then at least the first word in understanding how best to make sense of concepts such as mind, freedom, understanding, thought, action, agency, and many other notions that are connected up with philosophical chestnuts that go back thousands of years. And his view, alongside of views of other well-known ordinary language philosophers such as J.L. Austin and Ludwig Wittgenstein, was one according to which so many traditional philosophical problems are in many ways generated and expanded largely because of a misunderstanding of the language that we speak. Our intelligence has been bewitched by language, according to these philosophers, and if we can understand how language works, how we use everyday notions connected up with the words that make up our language, then we can get a better fix on these concepts in such a way as to see not so much solutions to these traditional problems, but more like dissolutions of them, to show that many of these problems are tempests in a teapot that depend for their very existence on misunderstandings and misconstruals of the language that we speak. So Ryle, in the process, also gives us I think a useful definition of philosophy, which he describes as the replacement of intellectual habit with intellectual discipline. In philosophy, we often we come to the table with lots of assumptions and lots of habits of thought that support those assumptions about the nature of the relationship between the mind and the body, freedom of will, knowledge, truth, etc. And our job is to stand back from many of those assumptions, scrutinize them, think about whether those assumptions are all mandatory and what other points of view about those problems we might have. And in the process, turn our opinions into things that we can possibly justify, support, be clear about, and thereby be more intellectually disciplined. Being intellectually disciplined does not mean being intellectually rigorous. It's more like a kind of mental suppleness, where you might know what you think, you can give reasons for what you think, but you can also see around your own point of view to the point that you'll be able to understand somebody else's opposed position and perhaps make sense of them. In addition to giving us a useful definition of philosophy, Ryle is often classed as one of the leading behaviorists of the middle part of the 20th century. And while I don't think that that's untrue, I believe that that is misleading for the following reason. Ryle does, as we'll see in a moment, put a great emphasis on the nature of behavior. However, he's very different from the behaviorists that are associated with behaviorism and psychology for the following reasons. People like Watson, and then after him Skinner, many other prominent behaviorists in the field of psychology, thought that the only way in which to make psychology a rigorous field was to give up talk of mental states, because according to them, mental states are not rigorously, scientifically measurable and capable of rigorous scrutiny. Give up talk of mental states, talk instead just of inputs into the organism and the organism's output in terms of its behavior. And that's the way and the only way in which we're going to be able to get a rigorous scientific theory of the mind, according to these psychologists. So the idea of talk of mental states, minds, beliefs, other types of mental states, and so on is going to be not scientifically legitimate for these psychologists, whereas for Ryle, talk of the mind, talk of mental states of which it's composed is perfectly legitimate as long as you understand what those things mean. Talk of minds is perfectly okay. And that's partly because Ryle's not trying to put a theory of mind on a scientific foundation. Rather, according to Ryle, we have as much knowledge as we need to have about the nature of mind. There's nothing hidden there that's beyond the veil that we could pull back by doing some rigorous scientific investigation. Rather, just by virtue of having access to common sense and our everyday understanding of ourselves and one another's minds, we know all that there is that we need to know about the mind. In the process of arguing for this position, Ryle, I believe, was perhaps the first philosopher to systematically and carefully provide a reasoned challenge to Descartes' argument for dualism. As I emphasized in our last lecture, Descartes' argument for dualism yields this surprising conclusion that the mind is distinct from anything in the physical world, including even the central nervous system. And while many materialists, such as Thomas Hobbes and 18th century philosopher known as La Mettrie, many materialists argued, or more precisely asserted their materialist position, they didn't explain what went wrong with Descartes' argument that leads us to this dualist conclusion. So in order to earn our right to the rejection of Descartes' dualistic position, we should try to figure out where his argument goes wrong, precisely why it's not cogent, rather than just asserting the contradictory of its conclusion. And one important theme in Ryle is going to be the idea that practical knowledge, or knowledge how, is no less important than propositional knowledge. He writes, summing up some of his overall view, the following: the philosophical arguments which constitute this book, The Concept of Mind, are intended not to increase what we know about minds, but to rectify the logical geography of the knowledge that we already possess. In warming up to his criticism of Descartes, Ryle talks about what he considers the official doctrine, which is something like Descartes' view as it has been consciously, or perhaps more commonly, unconsciously accepted by much contemporary thought. And Ryle characterizes this, perhaps abusively, as the doctrine of the ghost in the machine. The idea is that if you believe in Descartes' dualism, you have to think of each person's mind as something like a ghost in the machine, as something that is there inside of it, but in a way that doesn't make any clear sense if you scrutinize it more carefully. So this doctrine of the ghost in the machine is going to have a number of central tenets. I'll give you 6. First of all, each normal person, according to this doctrine, has both a body and a mind. Secondly, a person's body can be destroyed while their mind, being non-physical, can continue to exist even after the body's complete destruction. Bodies are located in space and time. This is part number 3, doctrine number 3, and are subject to the same mechanical laws as are any other physical objects like tables and chairs and bowling balls and clouds and mountains. Whereas minds are located in time but not in space. Talk of a mind as having a particular spatial location, according to this doctrine, is not going to make literal sense. And these minds are not subject to the same laws that govern physical objects. Minds may instead be subject to some kind of distinctive psychological laws, according to this view, but the laws of physics don't apply to minds, according to this doctrine. Each of us, this is number 5, is intimately aware of the workings of her own mind. We can introspect and know with certainty what's going on inside of us. By contrast, however, we may at best form conjectures about the minds of others, and we have no definitive way of settling whether those conjectures are correct or not. The best we can do is hypothesize what's going on inside of somebody's mind, but can never know for sure in the way that we can know for sure what's going on inside of our own. And then finally, number 6, minds and bodies seem to interact, but the locus of that interaction can itself be neither mental nor physical. So those are 6 core elements of the doctrine of the ghost and the machine, and Ryle's hoping to get you to see that if you focus on those more and scrutinize them, the idea that generates them, the dualist position that generates them, might look less obvious and less plausible than it first seemed. In particular, notice that idea of the locus of the mind and the body interacting. Is that interaction a physical or non-physical thing? Either way seems like it's going to generate some serious difficulties. Ryle's criticism of the whole ghost and the machine idea is going to be roughly as follows. Descartes and those who follow him are confused about the very idea of what a mind is. They're confused about the very concept of what it is to have a mind. In particular, Descartes has committed, according to Ryle, what Ryle referred to as a category mistake in characterizing the mind as a substance as well as a non-physical substance. What does that mean? What is a category mistake? A category mistake is a confusion about the logical status of a concept. Let me give you some examples to illustrate the idea. Suppose that you meet up with some friends for coffee one afternoon and they say, look, we're going to have a big adventure this summer. We're going to Romania, we're going to rent bikes, and we're going to ride across the country of Romania and see if we can't find the average Romanian taxpayer. And if so, hopefully we'll be able to take that person out to dinner, have some fun with him or her, and then we'll continue our journey to the other side of the country. Now, if you think about that, you'll probably see that the idea of the average Romanian taxpayer doesn't make any literal sense, for the reason that the idea of an average taxpayer is an abstraction from all the facts about the individual actual taxpayers that there are. Another example is as follows. Suppose you're studying at a university and you're happy to go there. It's a bit far away from home. And so one day your extended family comes to visit. You take your aunt and uncle, some cousins and so forth around, show them the buildings and the faculty members and the students and the athletic facilities and so forth. And then over dinner, you sit down with your uncle and your uncle says, thank you so much for showing us the buildings, the athletic facilities and the students and the faculty and staff and so forth. That was great, but I'm still not sure exactly where the university is. If that's what your uncle says, I think you'll feel like he's confused about what a university is. And you'll probably want to say, the university is not a particular thing at the level of building or individual people or even groups of people, but rather it's a whole collection of a number of different types of things. Buildings and people, institutions, traditions, expectations, norms, and so on. That's what makes up a university, and probably many other things as well. And they will only make it up if they are working together with a certain degree of harmoniousness. Some people have referred to many universities as cases of ossification tempered by anarchy, and that may well be true of many universities, but there needs to be, it can't be complete anarchy. If it's complete anarchy, you don't have a university anymore, as far as I can tell. So those are 2 examples of category mistakes. Another example is, suppose you've taken a friend from another country to see a match of a game, perhaps it's soccer, and they've never seen a soccer game before. And you try to explain to them how the game is played, and they're following along. And at the end of the game, your friend says, well, this is all great. I see where the goalie is and the forward and so forth. That's all fun. But where's the part of soccer that is known as esprit de corps, team spirit? Which player is the one that provides the team spirit part of the game? Again, I think you'll feel your friend is confused. You want to explain to them that team spirit is not a particular thing that's there on the field at the level of an individual player and what the player contributes to the game, but rather team spirit is the ability of all the different players to play together in a certain way. It's a higher level notion than being a forward or a goalie, for example. It's only if all the players are playing in a certain way that they've got team spirit. So again, 3 examples of category mistakes that a person can make, and those are relatively straightforward, relatively coherent, as examples of what it would be to commit a category mistake, and then Raoul's going to try to explain why he thinks Descartes makes a category mistake of a certain kind. Just to begin to wrap your mind around where Raoul's coming from here, think about, I'm guessing many of you have seen the movie from the 1990s called Forrest Gump, in which you've got a character that plays a man who is, at least on the face of it, a little bit slow, a little bit unusual. Maybe somebody might suspect that he's got some kind of mental disability. It's not quite clear. He had a physical disability as a young child, but he seems to have overcome it. But perhaps he still has a mental disability. But in order to respond to the criticisms that society makes of him, in order to keep his self-respect, he often cites his mother, who told him when he was growing up that stupid is as stupid does. And probably she would say similarly, smart is as smart does. And if Raoul had been alive when the movie came out, I suspect he would have said, yes, that's the right ballpark, the right general idea for thinking about what it is to have a mind. Being minded is not a matter of being made out of a certain kind of substance. Rather, being minded is a matter of behaving intelligently, or at least being disposed to behave intelligently. So what it means to behave or being disposed to behave intelligently is going to be crucial for Raoul's understanding of what a mind is, and then he'll use that as a criticism of Descartes. So for Raoul, intelligence is not an extra thing lying behind behavior. Rather, it's a feature of a certain kind of behavior. For example, think about cases of clowning, when somebody is clowning around in a witty way, making people laugh. Then that's an example of intelligent behavior right there in front of you. There need to be nothing lying behind it, so to speak, that makes it be intelligent, the absence of which would keep it from being intelligent. Rather, it's the way in which the clowning is done, or playing tennis in a crafty way, or playing chess in an aggressive manner, conversing sensitively. These are all ways of behaving, the ways of behaving that are intelligent, and that's the idea is that the intelligence is right there in public, in the open, and it doesn't have to be thought of as being a cause of a mental occurrence, but rather the idea is that it's intelligence right there, objectively available for everyone to see if they just look carefully enough. So Raoul would take the Forrest Gump doctrine, that stupid is as stupid does, smart is as smart does, and qualify them a little bit. He'd, I think, want to say stupid is as stupid does or tends to do. Smart is as smart does or tends to do. What does that mean? Well, Raoul's going to make a lot of use of the notion of a disposition. And to understand that, let's think about various dispositional notions. What does it mean to be a careful driver? Well, again, you can be fast asleep and still be a careful driver. What it means to be a careful driver is to be disposed to do a number of things. Make sure that your side and rear view mirrors are in view, appropriately adjusted, and to use them a lot. It means to keep an adequate distance behind people in front of you on a road. It means to be disposed to check your blind spot when you're changing lanes, and probably hundreds of other things. And those are things that don't require you reciting any general rules to yourself in order to be a careful driver. They're just rather in the habits that you've built and your competencies that you've developed over perhaps many years of driving. So more generally, a disposition is a special kind of what we've already referred to as a modal property. Remember, we talked about modal properties in discussing Descartes' argument for the distinctness of mind and body. A disposition is a feature of an object that can only be explained in terms of a proposition of the form, if X were to happen, then Y would happen. Dispositions can only be analyzed in those what are known as counterfactual terms. Now, Raoul's going to say that minds should be understood in a similar way as well. I think he'll always be uncomfortable talking about minds per se, but if you have to talk about a mind, then he's going to say that a mind is nothing but a huge collection of dispositions to behavior, what he'll call multi-track dispositions to behavior, of various kinds, such as being forgetful, or defensive chess player, or having a dry sense of humor, a rotten speller, a crafty arguer, an inept dresser, an awesome bird spotter, a good listener, somebody who's impatient about rules, and so on. For Ryle, that collection of huge numbers of dispositions that characterize your more or less intelligent behavior that collection is simply what it is to have a mind, what it is to be a minded individual. And if you know enough of these dispositional features of a person, he'll say, then there's no further question to ask about whether that person has a mind. To ask that question would be to commit a category mistake. So for Ryle, once you know how a person is disposed to behave under various conditions, will they react empathetically to somebody's suffering? Will they ask questions to better understand a perhaps puzzling point of view? Will they be aggressive in conversation? Will they dress in a certain way? Will they be good at distinguishing one kind of bird from another? Are they likely to play chess in a certain aggressive or more passive manner? Those are all characteristics of more or less intelligent behavior. And once you know all of those, Ryle will say, there's nothing else to know. And I think he can provide some intuitive support for that idea by pointing out that when you meet somebody new, a lot of what your radar is focused on, what you're thinking about as you're trying to figure out that person, is to determine those dispositions. Are they sensitive? That means, do they tend to behave in certain ways? Are they assiduous? Are they careful? Are they perceptive? Are they short-tempered? Are they easily offended? Are they forgetful? Are they overly anxious about things? Those are all dispositional notions. And Ryle will say that's what it is to characterize somebody's mind, how they, as it were, measure up on all those different kinds of dispositional characteristics, and there's nothing else to know once you know all of those. So let's be clear about how precisely that turns into an objection to Descartes. Remember, Descartes had assumed that it's in principle possible to exist disembodied. And I had asked you, well, before we talked about Descartes explicitly, to consider the question whether that was in principle possible. And I'm guessing that most students taking this class probably said, yeah, well, I guess it's in principle possible, even if I'm not a theist. I'm not sure I want to buy into the theistic views that's often associated with. Still, you might have said it's in principle possible. Ryle's going to say, if you think that, then I suspect you've committed a category mistake, because he'll say that an alleged disembodied mind, to put it provocatively first, may still be dumb as a bag of hammers, so to speak. More precisely, we have no clear idea what it would be for a purely disembodied entity to act intelligently. We have no clear idea of what it is for an entity that's purely disembodied to behave intelligently, or for that matter, unintelligently. There's no notion of behavior that we can make sense of that would apply to something that's purely non-physical. And you can see this, a little bit of evidence for this, when you think about the many movies, stories you've probably heard of various kinds that represent a supernatural being of some sort interacting with a physical being. Think, for example, of the famous movie The Seventh Seal, taking us back to the 1950s. And we've got a case in which a knight has come back from the Crusades, and he perhaps has contracted the plague that has afflicted the rest of his countrymen after he's returned home, and death is coming for him. And this knight challenges Death to a game of chess and says, okay, Death, if I can beat you in chess, will you let me off the hook? Will you let me go? And Death says, sure, it's a deal. So they undertake a game of chess.
Du fick svart. Det passar ju bäst så. Intressant.
Notice that Death can't play chess with the knight unless he takes some kind of physical form. It doesn't make any sense to suppose, or at least it's very obscure what it would be for a purely non-physical thing to play chess with a physical individual. And by the same token, even in a purely non-physical realm, suppose you've got two alleged angels or other disembodied spirits, how could they do anything? Play chess, or for that matter, anything else? Non-physical chess? Do we know what that means? So Ryle's objection is going to be the following. While perhaps he can't prove conclusively that the idea of a non-physical entity behaving in some way is absurd in the way that I think I can prove conclusively that the idea of a largest integer is absurd, I suspect Ryle will say the idea of a purely non-physical thing behaving in one way or another, intelligently or not intelligently, at least is one that we don't have any idea what it means. We have no idea what it means to behave in one way or another. We can't form any clear idea as to what that would come to. So Rao will say, putting this together in sort of a nutshell, to have a mind, you have to either behave or be disposed to behave intelligently. Habits are a low-level case of mindedness. There are intelligent things that we can do out of habit. For example, people in the military are required to make drill after drill every day over thousands of hours, required to drill form behavior in response to, for example, being under attack, so that when they're actually under attack in a genuine combat situation, they don't panic, but they behave reasonably intelligently. A higher level notion of intelligent behavior is what you might think of as a skill. And it's higher level because, unlike a habit, it's probably going to be more sensitive to different kinds of events that could happen in the environment. As the environment changes, the skilled person, for example, a pilot, knows how to respond. We wouldn't want the pilot of an airplane that we're on acting purely out of habit. That would make us feel less confident that if a crisis were to arise, then the pilot would be ready to respond to it. And perhaps an even higher level of intelligent behavior and dispositions there too is what we see in the level of expertise. So an expert pilot is one who knows how to land in an emergency situation that's perhaps been unprecedented, such as landing in the middle of a river and saving the lives of all the people on the plane. So habit on one level, skill on another level, expertise on the highest perhaps, are all going to be cases of intelligent behavior. And we get more and more intelligent as we get more prepared to respond to unprecedented and challenging situations. Still, the expertise is right there in the behavior itself. The skill is right there in the behavior itself, and so is the habit. So the premise that Descartes relies on crucially, that it's possible to exist in a purely disembodied way, I think we could justifiably say, I'm not sure that it is possible. I'm skeptical of that first premise in your argument. And if that's right, then we have what I take to be the first genuine challenge to the cogency of Descartes' argument, which says, in effect, one of the premises is questionable. That premise that it's possible to exist purely disembodied is one that we can in good conscience call into question, and thereby suggest that even if the argument is valid, that is, even if the premises are all true, the conclusion must be, still say, I'm not sure that one of those premises is true, and as a result, stand firm in the face of that argument for dualism and be unconvinced of its conclusion. In a second chapter, Ralph focuses on the relationship between knowing how and knowing that. As I mentioned before, Ralph is one of the philosophers in the 20th century who emphasizes not just the importance of propositional knowledge, but knowing how, what sometimes is referred to as ability knowledge. And remember that while knowing that is a matter of having justified true belief that a certain proposition is the case, knowing how is more like a skill, competence, in some cases even expertise. Knowing how to do something such as, for example, spot a certain species of bird, or converse empathetically, or tie a certain kind of knot. And again, you can know how to do something even if you're fast asleep or for some other reason not doing it, but rather you're disposed to do that under the right conditions. Rao will now say, after distinguishing between knowing how and knowing that it's tempting, especially for those that he considers to be part of the Platonic and Cartesian tradition that's also taken up by many other philosophers in the Western tradition, that it's tempting to say, well, all knowing how must be the result of some kind of propositional knowledge. And Rao talks about what he refers to as the intellectualist doctrine. That intellectualist doctrine is precisely the view that all intelligence is a matter of apprehending truths, and therefore behaving intelligently is a matter of applying that apprehension of truths to action, to agency. You might think about cases in which, suppose you're just learning how to drive, and there are facts about how one should drive, when in a certain kind of situation, the right thing to do is so-and-so. And it might be that you have those before your mind when you're learning what to do under certain circumstances, or perhaps when you're learning to play chess, you've got certain rules, such as when this is moved in a certain way, you have to move two forward and one to the right or one to the left. When this other piece is moved, it can only move one space forward at a time, etc. Those are truths, we might say, that govern the playing of chess. But Rao wants to suggest that these are ways in which you could learn these skills. You can state them as facts or truths if you want to, and then applying them in practice, but those are not mandatory. And the reason is that he asks us to imagine a child who just watches lots of chess games, watches people playing chess for many years, and gradually absorbs the game without ever paying attention to the question whether there are any particular rules. He learns the rules, but is never aware of himself as doing so, and certainly couldn't tell you what the rules are in the course of playing the game. And he could become a very good chess player in the process. Or to take a more contemporary example, one that became very influential after the writing of Raoul's book, the example of learning language. According to contemporary linguists, at least the majority of linguists, when you learn a language, you internalize a huge number of rules as to how grammatical sentences can be constructed, to say nothing of what words mean. And generally speaking, when you internalize those rules, you're not aware of yourself as doing so. And in fact, when you take a linguistics class, you might be surprised to learn that there are lots of rules that govern how you how you transform one sentence into another for purposes of efficient communication. You're aware of the fact those transformations are perfectly meaning preserving. They are synonyms of the original thing that was transformed, but you're not aware, at least at the conscious level, of what it was that you were doing in the process. You internalize these grammatical rules, that is, but never, at least explicitly or consciously, formulate them in terms of propositions that then are applied to practice. Now, you can imagine an objection to Raoul's position here that says, well, maybe these are unconscious, they're internalized, but we're not conscious of the fact that we're doing so. We will get to that line of thought about unconscious mental states in a couple of lectures ahead of us. But for now, Raoul thinks that I suspect that Raoul would say, even if we could respond to these examples by positing unconscious rules, he'll want to say, nevertheless, it couldn't be that all intelligent behavior is due to the application of rules to particular cases, to particular practical cases. And here's why. What he refers to this as the crucial objection to the intellectualist legend. The crucial objection goes as follows. If you are an intellectualist, you're going to say whenever somebody behaves intelligently, they are applying a rule to the particular case at hand. Driving, playing chess, interpreting sentences, behaving politely, thousands of other cases are possibilities. But Raoul will say the application of a general precept or rule or a bit of propositional knowledge that you take yourself to have to the particular case in hand is something that you can do either better or worse, well or poorly, or somewhere in between. But that means that applying the general precept to the action in question is itself something that is intelligently done or not. But when it's intelligently done, that must be because there's a rule that says when you've got rule type X, apply it in a certain way to action situation type Y. So that you've got to have as it were, a meta rule that tells you how to apply the non-meta, the lower level rule, to the particular action question that's confronting you. But wait, the application of that meta rule to tell you how to apply this rule to this particular action situation is something that can be done better or worse. So Raoul suggests there must be another rule, a meta rule, that you have to invoke in order to apply the meta rule to the first level rule to the action, and that's a regress that will never stop, according to Raoul. So the crucial objection that Raoul offers to the intellectualist legend is one that says, in order to apply even the simplest rule, you'd have to apply uncountably many rules in the process, and that seems incredibly implausible as an account of what happens when a person moves their chess piece effectively and within the rules, or speaks grammatically, or listens empathetically, or distinguishes one bird from another. That all seems like it puts much too much pressure on intellectual operations to explain relatively straightforward competencies, skills, and in some cases, even expertise. So the idea is that even if there is some, and Raoul's, I think, happy to accept that there's plenty of propositional knowledge, that can't be all the knowledge that there is. There must also be some know-how that is not itself backed up by propositional knowledge. Again, to take more examples of what Raoul considers to be intelligence that's right there in front of you, that does not require, supposing that the person in question is applying rules to the case at hand. He asks you to think about a clown, for example, at a birthday party, clowning cleverly in such ways to make the children giggle. That clever clowning is something that's right there in the behavior itself. You don't need to suppose that the clown is applying rules to the particular case. The clown is just doing what comes naturally to him or her. Likewise, there are plenty of cases in which we say things to ourselves. We might have to, especially if we're novices in a certain area that requires skill, we might have to repeat to ourselves various precepts as to how to act. But once we've internalized what to do, there no longer has to be the application of general rules to particular cases of action. After a while, we have what Rao will refer to as second nature competencies that are fairly automatic, that don't require a great deal of cognitive labor, but that still allow us to behave in quite competent ways. So getting back to this notion of multi-track dispositions, if we think of minds as large congeries of multi-track dispositions, we're going to say many of those dispositions are relatively high level and might be the result of a fair bit of rigorous, painstaking, long-term training. Some authors have said, for example, that to be an expert in something, you have to have spent about 10,000 hours acquiring that expertise. That might be true. But once you've got that expertise, there's no reason to think that you have to have before your mind general precepts or rules or propositions that guide your behavior. So even for very high-level types of skill, sometimes somebody can just follow, if they have the appropriate skills, just follow their gut and make judgments that require a great deal of sophistication. That doesn't mean that if I don't have that skill, that my gut feeling is going to be worth very much. But for the gut feeling of an expert art historian or forensic scientist, or jurist, or physician, that those gut feelings can often be very powerful indicators of how to proceed in deciding about difficult situations, in some cases on which people's lives might depend. We can think of Descartes' position as almost yielding to a reductio ad absurdum. And that reductio ad absurdum is the idea of solipsism. Solipsism being the view that I know that I have a mind, I know that I exist and have mental states, but the idea that anybody else has them is going to be at best a conjecture that I can never know for sure to be true. But Rao says, look, if you've got yourself into a position that has that as a consequence, there's probably something wrong with the position that forced you there. Instead, he writes, I discover that there are other minds in understanding what people say and do, in making sense of what you say, in appreciating your jokes, in following your arguments, in hearing you pick holes in my argument. I'm not inferring to the workings of your mind. I am following them. So the idea that I can follow the workings of your mind right there as a teacher watches the school child go through some mathematical calculations, as the violin teacher watches the student practice her scales on the violin, for example. Those are all going to be cases in which the expert can see the intelligent behavior right there in the action, doesn't have to infer anything about the mind that brought it about. This is an important insight on Rao's part, it seems to me. Nowadays, in contemporary experimental psychology, there's a lot of interest in what's known as embodied cognition. And I want to suggest that Rao's way of expressing himself here is a bit of a sort of prescient glimpse of a view that's becoming widely discussed and substantiated by a fair bit of empirical investigation, the idea of embodied cognition. If Rao's right, yes, there's a lot of cognition that's right there in the behavior, and we don't need to suppose that it's the result of anything internal. It could be, but the important thing is that it doesn't have to be. There can be intelligence and intelligent behavior right there before our eyes. Here's some other applications of Rao's view. Rao has a lot to say about self-knowledge, has a chapter in his book on that very topic, and in the course of criticizing the view that he wants to reject, he talks about what he refers to as, according to the ghost in the machine kind of position, refers to a twofold dimension of privileged access. The first fold, the first aspect of it, he calls phosphorescence, what sometimes is referred to as consciousness. The idea of phosphorescence, the image there is, if something is happening in my mind, then it's, as it were, inherently glowing, and therefore I can't miss it. I can't fail to notice that it's occurring. Nowadays, you might refer to that as consciousness in the sense that when I'm having an experience, When something mental is happening, I've also got something higher order that is directed upon that experience. This is connected up with the higher order thought theory of consciousness. That's one aspect of the traditional notion of privileged access. And the other aspect of it is what you might call introspection, or alternatively, infallibility of introspection. The idea there is that if I think something's in my mind, then I cannot be mistaken in that view. Remember, Descartes thought, I can look inside the contents of my own mind and find things like the idea of an infinite substance. Descartes, and a contemporary proponent of that view, is going to say, even if I can't find something like that, I can still know for sure that, for example, it seems to me as if I'm sitting in a chair, or it seems to me as if I've got a dull ache in my left ankle. Those are cases of introspection, and more precisely of infallible introspection. So, to put it a little bit more formally, phosphorescence is the view that if something is happening in my mind, then I'm aware of it. And introspection/infallibility is the view that if I think something's happening in my mind, then it in fact is. Now, you can imagine objections to both of those views. Consider a possible objection to the phosphorescence idea. This is an idea that goes back to David Hume. Imagine, Hume says, that you are standing on the balcony outside of a building, and as you stand there, for example, talking to a friend, you find that the support of the balcony has just given way, and you're now plummeting through the air towards the ground at a very high speed. You'll probably experience panic at that point. You'll have a case of panic. There's a mental phenomenon going on inside you, the emotion of extreme fear that we call panic, but you probably also don't have enough mental space, as it were, to notice, hey, you know what, I'm feeling some panic. Your mind is just full of the experience of panic, of abject terror as you fall through the air. So here's a case in which you've got a mental phenomenon, the panic, but there's not a higher order mental event that is taking notice of it. And that would be, it seems, a counterexample to the idea of phosphorescence. We'll see in our next class another challenge to this view that comes from the idea of the unconscious. The psychoanalytic tradition suggests there are lots of unconscious phenomena that activate your behavior, that cause you to behave in various ways, but of which you're not aware. Rowell also talks about what he refers to as the systematic elusiveness of I. And on that idea, you can have a number of higher order thoughts directed towards lower order mental phenomena, but it's not clear that that process could go on forever. It seems like there's some high order thought, perhaps it's the 17th order, that you're not able to take cognizance of by virtue of an 18th order cognitive event or mental event. And so the systematic elusiveness of the I is the idea that there's no way in which I can take complete and comprehensive view of what's going on inside of my mind. The idea being that the viewer is going to herself not be subject to that very view. Those are potential objections to the phosphorescence idea. Potential objections to the infallibility idea, infallibility introspection idea, come in cases like self-deception. When I tell myself, for example, that I'm feeling happy about something when in fact I'm not particularly happy about it. When I tell myself that I'm content with a certain situation or that I'm frustrated with a certain situation, I might be deceiving myself. Willfully or not, we'll come to see those in more detail when we talk about self-deception later on. But it does seem as if there are cases in which I might believe that something is going on inside of my mind, but in fact be mistaken. So you can see objections to both the phosphorescence and the infallibility idea. And Rowell gives a nice example of how a person can be deceived that I think shows some nuances to how things can happen in everyday human life. He gives the example of a man whistling Tipperary, Tipperary being a famous British song that, for example, soldiers famously would sing as they were going into battle. And Rowell writes, someone may be aware that he's whistling Tipperary and not knowing that he's whistling it in order to give the appearance of a sang-froid, a kind of devil-may-care attitude, which he does not feel. Or again, he may be aware that he's shamming sang-froid without knowing that the tremors which he is trying to hide derive from the agitation of a guilty conscience. He may know that he has an uneasy conscience, but not know that this issues from some specific repression. So Rowell suggests that a person might be behaving in a everyday, nonchalant manner and be mistaken about the reasons for their behaving in the way that they do. So Rowell wants to give a number of different possible objections to the traditional ghost in the machine picture of self-knowledge that many of us on some level feel a certain amount of sympathy towards, Rao wants to suggest you want to extrude that from your thinking about the nature of your knowledge of yourself. And so that raises the question, what should we put in its place? Rao has a positive view of the nature of self-knowledge. If our question is how and in what way and to what extent do we know our own minds, his answer is a bracingly simple one. I know what's going on in my mind, and I know better, generally speaking, than what's going on in other people's minds, simply because I hang out with myself more than I do with other people. And even though my eyes are directed outward, away from my body, still I'm generally speaking cognizant of what I'm doing. And if you're the kind of behaviorist that Rao is, you therefore would expect that since my thinking, as we just saw, my thinking is something that's discernible right there in my behavior, an early version of the embodied cognition idea, then I know what I'm thinking, because I know what I'm doing. I know how I'm behaving. So it is that for Ryle, I have self-knowledge, all right, but it's the same kind of knowledge that you could have of me. There's nothing special, distinctively privileged about my knowledge of myself. And in fact, you can also imagine that, especially because our eyes are directed outward, not towards our own bodies, generally speaking, you can imagine that over a period of time, one person could get superior knowledge of somebody else's mind to what that person has of her own mind. So imagine a couple that has been together for many, many decades. It might be that once we enter decade number 5 or 6, one of them generally knows what's going on in the mind of the other better than that other one does about her own mind. That at least is the implication of Ryle's view. So for Ryle, introspection is fine as long as you take it off its pedestal and think about how I can introspect by virtue of the fact that I can watch myself watch my behavior. And introspection is possible, and there's an asymmetry between my own knowledge of myself and my knowledge of others. But that asymmetry is de facto, but not de jure. I happen, generally speaking, to know myself better than I know others because I spend more time with myself, generally speaking, than I do with others. But if I spend many decades with another person, then given that my eyes tend to be more likely focused on her than on my own body, for example, it may well happen that I come to know her mind better than I know my own. And many of you might have had experiences in which, for example, a significant other says, hey, for example, you're angry. And then you notice, oh yeah, I guess I'm kind of angry. I'm doing the things that I generally do when I'm angry. I start clenching my fists and my lip curls or my left eyebrow starts to twitch. And you had noticed that. The other person who knows what you well had noticed that. And she might thereby have cottoned on to your emotional state even before you did. So Ryle's view of self-knowledge, he does think that there's such a thing as self-knowledge, but he wants to demystify it, take it off a pedestal, and say it's just something that we happen to have, but it's just because we are able to observe our own behavior. Nothing especially exciting about it as a result. As you'll learn throughout the course of these classes in the Know Thyself course, whenever I discuss a theorist who often will criticize somebody else, I'll often try to put some pressure on that theorist as well by criticizing them too. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about potential challenges to Ryle after we've seen him challenge Descartes. One such challenge is the following. We've said that for Ryle, mindedness is a matter of being disposed to behave in intelligent ways. But you might ask about potential challenges to that. So, for example, there's the case of what's known as locked-in syndrome, in which a person is paralyzed. In some cases, the paralysis includes everything except for a person's eyelids, and they might be able to blink their eyelids, and because of that, can painstakingly communicate with others if they can develop a code system correlating numbers of blinks with eyelids with letters of the alphabet. Imagine how difficult that would be, but at least it would be a chance to communicate with the outside world if you have locked-in syndrome. In other more extreme cases, as I understand it, extreme advanced cases of Lou Gehrig's disease will bring this about, not just locked-in syndrome, but also cases in which you can't even blink your eyelids, so you can't move any muscles at all, at least those that are under your voluntary control. Now, in that kind of case, you might say it still seems like the person like that could think. Imagine being wholly and completely paralyzed. It still seems like, at least for a while, you'd be able to imagine what you did yesterday and trying to figure out what happened to you because you just woke up in the hospital and find that you can't move any part of your body, or think back on events from your childhood, or perhaps you'll form an image of what you wish you were doing right now, or imagine a triangle or a golden mountain. Those all seem to be things you can do, and more precisely, they're mental phenomena. But you might ask, well, in what sense are they behavior? Aren't these cases of thinking that don't involve any kind of behavior? Now, I think Ryle, I'm not sure exactly what Ryle would say about this because he tended to be a bit dismissive about cases from the sciences as potentially important for understanding the mind. As we saw, he holds that we know everything we need to know about the mind just by virtue of the fact that we've got access to common sense. But a sort of contemporary defender of Ryle, who's reasonably well up to date with neuroscience and experimental psychology, might say behavior is not identical with bodily motions. Bodily movements that are intentional and under our control are going to be one kind of behavior, but not the only kind. So long as we described before behavior as something that is effortful, requires a certain amount of effort, and it's something over which we do have control. But notice that on that characterization of behavior, even someone who's suffering from locked-in syndrome can still behave. Imagine that she attempts to, for example, count backwards from 100 by 3. She will have to exert some effort to do so. And in the course of that, for example, she might get stuck at a certain point, she might get distracted, she might decide to stop. So that activity on her part of counting backwards from 100 by 3s is going to be something that meets our criteria for behavior. It's effortful, and it's something that's under her control. If that's right, then even someone who can't move a single muscle can still behave. And it might be that nowadays we might detect some of that behavior by virtue of an MRI machine or fMRI type of device. But that doesn't prevent it from being an application of mind and as well as an application of behavior at the same time. So I would suggest that a contemporary Rylean doesn't have to completely give up her view in light of examples like locked-in syndrome. I'll come back in a moment to other questions that we might raise about Ryle's view. Another potential challenge to Ryle that I think might go farther than the challenge that comes from the case of locked-in syndrome, however, is as follows. David Armstrong, the Australian philosopher, in the 1960s formulated an objection that goes like this. Armstrong said, "I don't deny that mentality is crucially bound up with dispositions to intelligent behavior. But that can't be all there is to the story. There must be something deeper than that. Think of it this way. A shaker of salt contains stuff that's soluble. It's disposed to behave in a certain way, namely dissolve when put into an unsaturated liquid. But the progress of science requires that whenever possible, we take those dispositional attributions and explain why they hold, explain why they're true, explain in virtue of what salt behaves the way that it does. And physical chemistry offers precisely that explanation as to why it is that salt behaves in the way that it does when put in a fluid that's not saturated, why gasoline tends to combust, why glass tends to shatter, and so on. So, Armstrong suggests, shouldn't we also expect that there is a non-dispositional, what he calls a categorical basis for the behavior of human beings and other minded creatures when they behave intelligently? Shouldn't we expect that as science progresses, we're going to find something non-dispositional that explains why it is that angry people tend to behave in one way, sad people tend to behave in another, someone expecting rain tends to behave in one way, someone looking forward to an event they're excited about tends to behave in another? Armstrong sums this up when he writes, "When I think, but my thoughts don't issue in any action, it still seems obvious that there is something actually going on in me which constitutes my thought. It's not just that I would speak or act if some conditions that are unfulfilled were to be fulfilled." And I think this quotation is in a way sort of hovering between two different thoughts, both of which are worth our attention. One of which is what philosophers now refer to as the qualitative nature of experience. Suppose we replace the example of thinking with the example of an experience. Suppose that I'm experiencing some pain. Perhaps my left ankle is aching again because of the change in the weather or something. Now, it's true that by virtue of that pain, I might tend to behave in a certain way, perhaps favor it when I walk or rub it or something. But it seems like there's more to the pain than that. The way in which pain feels, the qualitative nature of pain, doesn't seem like it's captured by the fact that I tend to behave in a certain way. Or think about the difference between a sensory experience like smell. There's a difference, a definite difference between, for example, the smell of sulfur, that rotten egg smell, and the smell, for example, of cinnamon. Those smell different ways. Do they have to be bound up with dispositions towards different behavior? It's not so clear. It's unclear to me that we can account for their difference in terms of my dispositions to behave in different ways in the face of sulfur on the one hand, cinnamon on the other, sulfur on the one hand, and burning rubber on the other. Sulfur and burning rubber are aversive. I might try to get away from them, but I don't think my behavioral responses to the two of them can track how it is they feel differently to me. So that's one disambiguation of Armstrong's objection. And I think I want to suggest that Ryle's view does not have the resources to account for what philosophers now refer to as the qualitative nature of experience. Another one is that, forgetting about the qualitative nature of experience, just the fact that I might be thinking something right now, it's true that I can be thinking something right now, even if I'm not expressing that thought, that mental event in terms of behavior. And while Ryle himself tends to be dismissive of scientific psychology, and probably also would have been dismissive of neuroscience had he been asked about it, I don't think that we have to be. We can accept some of the insights from Ryle and say, in some cases, as, for example, our progress in the sciences goes forward, as we get a deeper understanding of, for example, the neuroscience of emotion. We'll be talking about that in a future lecture, by the way. As we get a deeper understanding of the neuroscience of emotion, we can begin to understand why it is that different emotions have different behavioral implications in this on a non-dispositional basis. For example, we now know that under conditions of extreme anger, there's an increase of blood flow to the arms, whereas under conditions of extreme fear, there's an increase of blood flow to the legs. That's something you might expect given the kinds of emotions anger and fear are. But those are non-dispositional, categorical bases that might be part of an explanation at least, of how it is that fear and anger produce different behavioral signatures, as it were. A lot of work in contemporary affective science, which includes both neuroscience and experimental psychology, is going to, I think, shed light on why it is these dispositions to behavior that come with, for example, emotions have the shape that they do. But that requires taking some part of Ryle and setting it aside, for the reason that Ryle, as we saw, tends to be dismissive of the entire mind-body problem. If you asked him, are you a materialist or a dualist, he would say that's a silly question, because that question presupposes that the mind is a kind of substance or thing, and I doubt that. A lot of the point of the book was to challenge that idea. Nevertheless, if we say, let's give that up, talk about mentality as dispositions to intelligent behavior, we can still say a neuroscientific examination of mentality might still shed light on things, not just phenomena such as locked-in syndrome, but also the neurological basis of, for example, emotions. And if we take that approach, we might still want to suppose, for example, that a materialist view of mentality has something going for it. In that respect, part ways with Ryle, while still hold on to the view that mentality is crucially bound up with behavior, and in many cases even behavior that's there observable in the public eye or potentially open to public view, as opposed to part of a private, ghostly realm, something that we can all, with good reason now, find ourselves with reason to reject. One further dimension of this course that I'd like to introduce you to now is that of the meditative moment, where I'll be asking you to spend just a couple of minutes engaging in some very, I hope, non-threatening, not too challenging meditation. And by meditation, I don't mean anything spiritual, anything transcendental at all, but just a way of trying to focus the mind, calm the mind. And part of what I'm aiming at is to help you realize that many of us, I don't know about all, but many of us are probably multitasking to our detriment. And if we can begin to think about monotasking, begin to think about focusing on the here and now, what project we're engaged in, we perhaps might be able to pay attention more intensely and thereby achieve what we want to in a more satisfying, fulfilling way. And one step in that direction is the meditative moment, where I'll just ask you to spend a minute or two doing something, doing very little of something, and then with luck that will help you to, so to speak, calm the waters of the mind. So this is a meditation bowl that I picked up in Singapore many years ago. I'm going to strike it, and I'll ask you to pay attention to the sound that I make. I'll use a little clapper to revolve around it to make a kind of resonant sound. Ask you to think about that. And then try to focus on the sound. Focus on nothing but the sound. And if you have some other thoughts that come your way, acknowledge them, maybe even mentally say hello to them, and let them float on by like clouds in the sky as you go back to thinking about the sound. Today I'd like to talk about the topic of human nature as part of a general discussion of our attempts to, and the significance of, and the limitations of our abilities to know ourselves. So how does human nature relate to the phenomenon of self-knowledge? The phrase human nature is often taken to suggest that we have a nature flowing from our status as human beings. This is not normally thought to exhaust all that a person might want to know about herself or himself, but it would seem, at least according to many theories of human nature, to be an important substratum, an important dimension of the whole story you'd like to have about yourself if you're engaged in self-understanding. And it's a potentially important substrat, that is, if your nature as a human being is such as to make you inherently prone to violence or wickedness, or for that matter, being inherently prone to sympathy or generosity, then this would be a good thing to know on the way to self-knowledge, because self-knowledge is not just knowledge of that, but also the ability to make good use of that knowledge, bordering on the phenomenon that we discussed earlier, that is under the rubric of wisdom. The wise path, that is to say, would be to take the heed of what we can learn about our nature as human beings or as members of some other broader category, and then to take measures to control, develop, or otherwise respond appropriately to the thing we've thus realized. Notice, though, that the phrase human nature is kind of a curious one. It suggests that we have an essence flowing from our status as human beings. But this idea that we have an essence that flows from our status as human beings is not one that we should take for granted, not the one that we should take uncritically. First of all, for some people, talk of our nature may be a way of avoiding responsibility for things that are really more a matter of choice than things that happen to us. And furthermore, if we do have a nature that's there to know, it may flow from our status, for example, not so much as human beings, but rather it may be due to our status as great apes, or as primates, or mammals, or maybe even as chordates. That is to say, what's distinctive of us as human beings may not be that terribly interesting. It may be something that we share with members of a broader class, such as that of mammals or great apes, for example. Nevertheless, a traditional way of thinking about human nature as being something that allows us to understand something distinctive of ourselves, qua human beings, is expressed by the poet Alexander Pope in his essay on man. He writes, "Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man. Placed in this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great, with too much knowledge for the skeptic side and too much weakness for the stoic's pride, he hangs between, in doubt to act or rest, in doubt to deem himself a god or beast, in doubt his mind or body to prefer, born but to die, and reasoning but to err, alike in ignorance his reasons such, whether he thinks too little or too much." Pope expresses a widely accepted way of thinking here, which is that the thing that we ought to study, if we're going to be studying anything at all, should be ourselves, and more precisely, ourselves as human beings, as opposed to ourselves understood as members of a broader category. So that's one characteristic set of views, but as I say, it's not one that we should take for granted as self-evident, but rather one that we want to start with as a subject for further investigation. As we think about the nature of human nature, it's also useful, I think, to discuss some other dimensions of various theories that you might have about it. Some theories about human nature will vary from one another in terms of how positive or negative they are. For example, some theories will be very positive in the sense of characterizing human beings in a very optimistic way, whereas others will tend to characterize human beings in a fairly negative way, as being prone to violence, for example, or destruction or selfishness. You might also have differences among theories of human nature characterized in terms of how complete or partial they are. Some theories might claim to tell you everything you need to know about yourself by telling you about yourself qua human being, that is, about your nature. Others will be more partial and more sketchy in that respect. Likewise, different theories of human nature will differ from one another in terms of how much they allow you to know the answer, that is, find out about yourself in either a priori or a posteriori terms. Is it something you can get by introspection, for example, or is it something that requires scientific or some other kind of empirical investigation? Likewise, is your theory of human nature one that's anecdotal, based on your private experience or the experiences of your friends, or is it something more rigorous, depending upon controlled trials or something of the kind? Likewise, a theory of human nature might differ from another by taking a certain view about how malleable we are. To what extent are human beings, even if they have a shape, as it were, is that shape one that can change with greater or lesser effort? Likewise, is a theory of human nature going to be one that's focused on actual facts about how things are, or will it be focused on more on potentialities and what we're capable of, as opposed to how things actually go in the real world? And furthermore, we might also notice that human nature might be thought of as coming in layers. There can be something that you might consider primary nature, the nature that we are, for example, born with and will tend to develop if we develop normally. But on top of that, there's something you might call second nature. This second nature is something that's in some sense built on the first as a sort of second layer. It's presumably built by means of training, either explicit or implicit. And it involves such things as the acquisition of habits, sensibilities, predilections, preferences, tastes, and so forth, so that by the time you're an adult, it might be difficult to look inside and discern those habits of yours, those characteristic ways that you have that are learned, as opposed to those that somehow you were born with and that developed by virtue of your just happening to grow up. So there's, in addition to primary nature, there's second nature. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, at least in English. That would suggest that human nature involves a kind of composite between primary or first and second nature as well, where by the time we're adults, it's difficult to tell the two of them apart. Let's think then about a couple of particular views. I want to contrast the view of Descartes, who we've discussed before, and that of Sigmund Freud, who we'll be discussing in the next mini MOOC in this series. Descartes, as you know, thinks of himself as he looks inside in the second meditation, and he says he thinks of himself as a thinking being, a res cogitans in the Latin, a thing that is essentially one that thinks, whose nature is to cogitate, as it were. He realizes that he's closely bound up with his physical body, but he doesn't think that he's identical with it. That's the upshot of his dualistic argument. And he thinks that, it seems, he can get a deep understanding of his own nature by just introspecting on the contents of his mind and about the operations that he sees occurring inside of his mind, and infers from that that his nature is that of a thinking thing. That's something that has a certain kind of resonance, but you might also find, especially in the current climate and current sensibilities with our understanding of neuroscience and other developments and a posteriori types of reasoning, we might find ourselves thinking that that's at best a limited view about the self. Here's another that's still not quite up to date, but a view that opposes it fairly directly is that of Sigmund Freud, who will hold that much of our nature is not actually open to introspection, first of all, and secondly, consists in things that are perhaps upsetting to find out about and not easy to bring up to the surface and let out into the open and be aware of, because at the unconscious level, deep buried within ourselves, are powerful, unacknowledged drives towards, in particular, rampant sexuality and rampant violence. And Freud will hold that it's those urges inside of us that cause us to behave in the ways that we do, but also help explain why we put up with the bounds of civilization in the way that we do, because otherwise things will go badly. Otherwise things will become chaotic. There will be lots of carnage, destruction, and unhappiness all around. So we need to keep them locked up downstairs, as it were. The result, though, is that for Freud, we can't find out about our nature by introspecting in the way that Descartes might have thought. We can only find out about our nature, at least we'll have a chance of doing so, if we can engage in some empirical investigation. So whereas Descartes, we can understand ourselves and our own natures in an a priori way. For someone like Freud and many who follow him, if not agreeing with him in the particular details, will in general agree that our nature is something that is best understood not by introspective means, but rather by extrospective means, by looking outside and seeing what we do from a, so to speak, third-person perspective. Unlike Descartes, Freud will use what I'll be calling inference to the best explanation. That is, we find a body of data in our behavior, the behavior of others, and we argue that the best way to explain that body of data is by positing an aspect of our nature that is in some sense buried within. We look at that, we understand it, and if we can develop a satisfactory theory of how that all works and why it does, then we'll understand our nature, but not by looking inside. So one thing that's significant about this is that there are important strands in thinking about human nature that do not depend upon introspection, but rather depend upon an investigation of ourselves in ways that are nevertheless extrospective. So just as I can learn about myself, for example, my weight, not by introspecting, but by standing on a scale, Freud's going to say you can also learn about yourself by taking a third-person perspective on your own behavior. It helps to talk to other people and listen to what they've got to say about you. But in principle, you could set up enough video cameras and other recording devices to find out about how you behave in a way that's observable to others, including you, and thereby develop theories that explain why you do the things that you do. And furthermore, the warning that you might not very much like what you find. And a third view, we've talked about Plato already, a third view that's worth putting on the table as well is that of Plato, according to whom the soul, as he'll put it, is divided into three different parts: the appetitive, the rational, and the spirited. The rational part of the soul corresponds largely to Descartes' way of thinking about himself. The rational part of the soul is the part of the soul that thinks, cogitates, reasons, predicts, explains, and so forth, and should, all else being equal, be able to control the other parts. The appetitive has to do largely with satisfying the needs of the body. So hunger, sexual desire, thirst, etc. There's no reason to think that Plato would hold that the appetitive ought to be squelched and starved, either literally or metaphorically, needs to be satisfied, but it should not take control of the self. If it does, your life will go badly in the sense that your appetites will guide you and lead to bad choices in ways that you could probably predict. And then likewise, the spirited is a part of the soul for Plato that doesn't have a straightforward analog in contemporary theories about the self, but the spirited has to do with our social standing, our relations to one another. So for example, it's the spirited part of the soul that makes a person yearn for success, achievement, respect. It's the spirited part of the soul out of which pride grows, for example. Presumably also the spirited part of the soul for Plato out of which shame can grow when you've done something that you perceive to be a violation of social norms. So Plato will hold that there too, pride, for example, if it becomes too powerful and thereby allowing the spirited part of the soul to take over, will also make your life go badly because you'll be too hung up on pride. You'll be too worried about what people think about you. You'll be too concerned with impressing others. And so there's a way in which the spirited part of the soul can cause your life to go less well than it might otherwise do. So Plato will hold that the soul has three different parts. And the rational ought to be in control, but not completely strangling the other two, but rather keep them in place, keep them in check, allow them to fulfill their needs. A certain amount of pride and a certain amount of susceptibility to shame, for example, is something Plato would probably say is appropriate, is not out of line, but don't let them or likewise the appetites get too much control over you, otherwise your life will not go very well. As you can see, Plato is especially concerned in understanding the tripartition of the soul, in thinking about how to make our lives go in a way that we find satisfactory in order to help us achieve some form of happiness overall. Whereas Descartes is not specifically concerned with that. He's concerned more specifically with knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge and the development of a rigorous science. Freud is probably trying to do both at the same time, in the sense of trying to think about not just a theoretical understanding of ourselves, but also helping people to cope better with the world around them. So we've got three quite famous, quite influential theories about the self that all have implications for our understanding of human nature. You can decide what you think is the most plausible among these, but I also want you to consider, even if some of them might seem a little bit quaint, for example, Plato's tripartition, what analogs it might have to our contemporary ways of thinking about ourselves, our contemporary questions that we might have about ourselves, and whether or not these analogs can shed some light on otherwise difficult questions. Another important aspect of these theories of human nature is that many of them are directed towards answering questions about how best to live, either our own individual lives, so to speak, or politically as part of a large group of people. So if we understand aspects of our nature, that might shed some light on how we ought to do things, in particular, how we ought to organize ourselves into a society. Famously, the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes held that once we understand our natures, we will find also that it's best to keep that nature in check. So in a state of nature, he held, people would do what comes naturally to them, and what comes naturally to them, he would say, is to act in a generally selfish, self-interested way. And for that reason, there'd be little control over your resources, little ability to predict what's going to happen tomorrow, because you never know when somebody's going to try to take something away from you, violate your privacy or your person in some way or other. So Hobbes famously argued that if the state of nature were allowed free rein, if we were allowed to just be in a state of nature with no control over ourselves, lives in such a situation would be nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Hobbes' view had a great deal of resonance among philosophers of his day, political thinkers of his day, leaders of his day, as well as afterwards, and many held that, well, if that's the case, if that's what things would be like in a state of nature, then we'd better have in mind the application of some powerful government that would control us and keep us from going that way, from behaving in such a noxious and abrasive and destructive manner. And that's the way in which Hobbes and many who followed him argued for the justification of a political organization, such as a government or even a king. Later philosophers thought that Hobbes was onto something, but that he underestimated the positive side of human nature. So, for example, Bishop Butler and David Hume in a later century argued that human beings are indeed in large part selfish, are indeed in large part prone to violence, but they also have the capacity for what, for example, David Hume referred to as sympathy. Sympathy is a kind of quasi-technical term in David Hume. And Hume's idea of sympathy is something like the following. I have a natural and unreflective, fairly automatic reaction to the well-being, including the plight of other people. So, for example, even if I have no particular personal interest in the well-being of a particular child who lives, for example, in Nebraska, nevertheless, if I hear a report on the radio or on the news about how such a child fell down a fairly deep well, is alive but is stuck there and is having difficulty getting out, then I'm probably going to be clinging to the radio or some other news source in order to find out what happens and hoping very much that the child is saved. It's very natural for us to resonate automatically and unreflectively in a way that takes concern for the well-being of another. Just as if, unless you thought you were in danger of being harmed, if someone falls over in a crowded place, then you're likely to help that person get up. So long as you don't feel like you're being tricked into being robbed or something of the sort. So Hume would argue, following Butler, that many of us, at least if we're brought up and develop in a way that's relatively normal, relatively typical for our species, we're going to take some automatic and unreflective concern for the well-being of others, so long as doing so does not clash too violently with our own interests and needs. That sympathy, Hume, for example, would argue, can be seen as a basis for a form of government that does not require an absolutely rigid political organization, but a certain amount of flexibility, because people can be depended upon to act in a way that's relatively sympathetic towards one another, so long as there's not some strong counteracting force. So if that's right, then we have Hobbes on the one hand, Butler and Hume on the other, arguing that if we can find out what human nature is, that'll give us some pointers as to how we ought to organize ourselves into society. Other thinkers from different traditions, for example, Confucius, held that, yeah, for the most part, people are not too different from the way that Hume describes. They're largely self-interested. They start out as pretty good, capable of being improved. Generally speaking, not saints, but generally speaking, people don't start out as inherently evil either. And his focus was that on the improvement of the self, the refinement of one's character. At one point in the Analects, for example, Confucius writes, "Find inspiration in the odes, take your place through ritual, and achieve perfection with music." The idea here is the following. We start out with a pretty good self, not great, prone to error, prone to a certain amount of selfishness. But if we cultivate the self in the appropriate way, we can end up with something that is quite virtuous in the end. So human nature itself doesn't tell you a great deal about what we're like. It's kind of how we start, an imperfect stone in need of polishing. We polish it by means of things like such things as rituals, by cultivation, and thereby become a virtuous person. And you might be struck by the idea that rituals are an important part of developing the self. And ritual, indeed, was a larger part of traditional societies. On the other hand, you might wonder whether or not a good number of your activities are, in some sense, ritualistic. When you enjoy a sporting event, like a football match or a baseball game, when you get together with family members, when you go to a place of worship, there's a fair bit of ritual happening there. Not all of those activities are things that have to occur for purely practical purposes. There are certain routines you go through. And if that's the case, then that's one of the symptoms of something's being a ritual, and it helps tie a bunch of people together. They have something in common. But I think Confucius and those who follow him would also say that when that happens, you're also developing yourself. Because many of these rituals are not just things that you do, but they're in many respects other directed things. So when people sing a national anthem, when people clap applause for a performance, they're doing it jointly. They're doing it as a group, and they're acknowledging one another's existence and participation as fellow group members. There's a kind of pro-social nature of many of our rituals that puts us in the space, I think, points us in the direction of others as opposed to pointing you away from others. And as far as you're pointed in the direction of others, you are thereby becoming more of a social being. And generally speaking, as long as you're in a reasonably healthy society, becoming more of a social being, also, again, there are exceptions, there are limitations, but also is going to tend to make you a better person by virtue of that kind of cultivation. So a perspective that's valuable from Confucius is that our nature is a template on which we can write. We write by doing things. It's not as if our nature is something that's fixed and stays with us our entire lives. Rather, it's subject to a certain amount of plasticity. And that plasticity is something that we're responsible for working with, as it were. And our job is to develop into virtuous people. And Confucius would say, we develop into virtuous people by such things as self-cultivation, becoming cultured, as well as engaging in rituals. Rituals aren't inherently bad or boring or silly. They have a value, in large part because they allow us to exercise our pro-social types of abilities. Just to round out our picture a little bit more, a mid-20th century diametrically opposed view to those that we've considered thus far is associated with the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who talked about the notion of nothingness. And for him, the notion of nothingness is not so much complete non-existence, but rather the idea that ourselves are a kind of clean slate on which we've got to write. The existentialist movement held that there's no reason to believe in the existence of a divine being from whom perhaps one might hold morality can be derived or some other set of guidelines as to how one should live. Rather, one's got to, so to speak, create one's morality. One's got to, so to speak, take responsibility for being a self and being a self of a particular type. The idea of nothingness then is supposed to suggest that if you hold that it's human nature to do so-and-so, then the existentialist might hold that that's a bit of a cop-out. That's shirking responsibility from the thought that every time you decide to act, you've got to see yourself as a responsible agent. Otherwise, you're acting in what they might call bad faith. So the idea of nothingness is there's hardly any nature there to know. And furthermore, insofar as you posit a nature, there's an attempt at sort of deception, dissimulation, because you're acting as if something other than you yourself is responsible for the things that you do. Whereas the existentialist is going to say, no, you and no one else is responsible for the things that you do. And if that's right, then you have to start out with a blank slate and write it and take responsibility for what you write. This idea then of nothingness is one that it's hard to stare at, hard to hold on to, hard to keep fixed in your mind. But it's something that the existentialist will say is required to keep fixed in order to take full responsibility for living your life fully in the moment, living your life with full responsibility. By contrast, this was in the mid-century, later in the 20th century, we began to see theories of, for example, human emotions that had some substance that denied the claim that for example, existentialists wanted to make of complete emptiness, nothingness, extreme malleability. Theories of emotions that have developed in the last 50, 40 years suggest the following, that across our species, no matter whether you live in Papua New Guinea or whether you live in Canada, Chile, Argentina, Uganda, elsewhere, you share something with all other members of your species, or at least all neurotypical, as they will call them, members of your species. That is the capacity for various emotions, and not just various emotions, a particular set of emotions, often referred to as the basic ones. So it's fairly widely held among, for example, psychologists concerned with affect, that is theories of emotions and moods, that everybody's subject to at least the following types of emotions: happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise. Furthermore, each of those emotions has a kind of signature, characteristic way of running through a person. We know, for example, that happiness behaves in a certain way no matter what culture you're from, no matter what country you live in, pretty much no matter how you grew up or how you were raised. The idea being that happiness has a certain way that it feels phenomenologically. When you feel happy, you feel kind of uplifted. It feels good, of course, to feel happy, as opposed to bad. That's almost too obvious to be worth stating. Furthermore, happiness has, we now know, various characteristic physiological aspects, such as the release of certain hormones, endorphins, and so forth. Thirdly, happiness has a characteristic way that it presents itself physically on your body. For example, happy people tend to look a certain way. They smile. And generally speaking, happy people tend to behave a certain way. They have a lightness in their step. They have exuberance about them, etc. So there's a signature that's associated with the emotion of happiness. Likewise for sadness. We have a sense of what it is to be sad, how sad people behave. There's now a physiological understanding of sadness as well. When people are sad, certain things happen inside their central nervous systems, for instance. A certain way your face tends to look when you're sad, etc. Anger, we know the shape, the signature of anger, for instance. It feels a certain way, like you're boiling inside. There's a certain way your face will look if you're angry. There are studies that suggest that people who are angry have increased flow of blood to their arms, whereas people who are experiencing fear of a relatively substantial kind have an increased flow of blood to their legs, which, if you think about it from an evolutionary point of view, is not a crazy crazy way to be, because people who are angry tend to be ready to fight. People who are afraid tend to be ready to run. Likewise, disgust. Disgust is considered one of the basic emotions. It's got a certain way that it looks, probably a certain way that it feels from the inside, phenomenologically, a certain physiology, as well as a certain way that causes you to behave. When you are disgusted, literally disgusted by, for example, something that you just ate or smelled, you're going to retch, perhaps. You're going to make your face into a certain contorted way, etc. Likewise, surprise. We know what a person's face looks like when they're surprised, etc. So the idea is that these basic emotions are fairly pan-cultural. And if we need some substantial content to fill in our story about what human nature is, one good place to start, I suggest, would be the so-called basic emotions. Now, when I say they're basic and pan-cultural, I also want to acknowledge that there will be variation from one society to another, and maybe from one individual to another, and how emotions run through them. So according to some well-known theories of the emotions, on the basic level, we've got the substratum of basic emotions, but on top of that, we have what are called display rules. So for example, even if you are a Westerner on whose face happiness tends to display itself spontaneously, nevertheless, if you're at a funeral, the rules for funerals say things like this: don't smile too broadly, even if you see somebody you've not seen for many years. You are indeed happy to see them, and you have a tendency to smile, but your rules as to how to behave will tell you generally that you should keep that smile under control, lest you do something to embarrass yourself or someone else. Likewise, you can be angry, but there are situations in which you're supposed to keep your anger to yourself, at least in our society, or at least in Western societies. If you're watching this course, engaging in this course from a non-Western society, then I hope you'll share your experiences with these emotions on our discussion board. It would be very interesting to hear what you've got to say about your local society's rules for how people who are feeling fear, how people who are feeling surprise or disgust or anger or sadness are supposed to or not supposed to let them express themselves on their faces and their behavior, in what they say, and so on. Nevertheless, even if there are variations from one person and one culture to another in terms of how emotions are expressed, we can still discern, I suggest, a certain amount of commonality that has a physiological character, a behavioral character, and as well as an experiential character as well. That's a commonality that I would suggest is one piece of a larger puzzle that we might try to understand as the theory of human nature. So I've suggested that there is some substance to the idea of human nature, even if by looking at human nature we can't expect to learn everything we might want to know about ourselves. Nevertheless, at least the theory of emotions gives us some guidance as to what we're like. And if you know about human emotions, you know not just about how they behave inside of you, you know about how they behave inside of others. You know that, for example, someone who's angry is likely to be dangerous, either verbally or physically. You know that somebody who's very sad is likely to not have a whole lot of energy, for instance. Somebody who's very afraid is likely to try to go away, or in some other respect, shroud themselves from something they take to be a threat. This is what's known as folk psychology that we have by virtue of just growing up normally in a society and being reasonably attentive to how things happen around us. But also it's been reasonably well borne out by large swaths of experimental psychology and social psychology in particular, so that we can look to experiments to help us confirm the idea that there's certain particular ways, distinctive and characteristic ways, that people behave when they're in the grip of one of the basic emotions. You might also think about some of the so-called non-basic emotions. I've mentioned pride already in my discussion of Plato's tripartition. Are there emotions, one question is, are there emotions that are distinctive of a particular society? Do you experience emotions that you think are distinctive of society, the society that you occupy, either full or part-time? Some of my sources tell me that, for example, in Japanese, the word that we'd pronounce in English as ame refers to the experience that people have, a kind of state of bliss that a person has when they're lost in a large crowd of people. That's not an experience that I have when I'm lost in a large crowd of people. Bliss is not the first kind of feeling that I have. It's usually something more negative. But other people might feel differently. Now, if that's right, then ame is something that's distinctive of at least Japanese society. And if so, that's something we want to see as building on top of a basic emotion substructure, a thing that is something that perhaps you learn by virtue of being a member of Japanese society or other societies that value that kind of experience. Likewise, I'm told that in Portugal, people have the word saudade, which refers to that feeling of longing and nostalgia for the lost days of the Portuguese Empire. Now, again, I'm not part of a society that has much by way of a lost empire, and so that's not an experience that I have much direct access to, but those of you who are involved in the course might have something to contribute by way of whether you've experienced that, perhaps you're a member of Portuguese society, or whether you know people who are, or you're from a different society that experiences that. So if we think about non-basic emotions, they might be specific to a particular culture, or they might be something that is still fairly pan-cultural, but that depends upon a fair bit of cognitive apparatus. So it might be that every culture is one that's capable of having its members experience pride. But pride for one person might be based on something very different from what makes somebody else proud. What is it to be proud? And one question you might ask is, if our nature is such as to have the capacity for pride or shame, guilt, what role do these emotions have in, for example, social life? Does being part of a society in which one person is capable of pride, another person is capable of shame or guilt, does that tell us anything about how the society operates? And is it something that should be promoted, demoted, gotten rid of, taught, cultivated, etc.? So that's one set of questions that I think it's good to discuss. Another one is the following. Even if there's a substratum of basic emotions, and even if on top of that there is some non-basic emotions, such as ame on the one hand and pride on the other, we might also ask, having mentioned the notion of second nature, those things that are second nature to you are, as I've said, by the time you're an adult, they might seem, by introspective means, to be as much part of your nature as anything else. Your capacity to ride a bicycle might seem as basic and fundamental as your capacity to feel anger if you've been riding a bicycle for many, many years. Both might seem fundamental in the appropriate respect. Nevertheless, the bicycle riding was learned, whereas the capacity for anger was not. I want to suggest then that it's part of our nature that we have a lot of plasticity. Our nature is such as to be malleable. Our nature is such as to be shapeable, but only shapeable to a certain degree and up to a certain limit. Just as many of our organs have a degree of plasticity, a degree of flexibility up to a certain time, and then lose that flexibility over time, such as the lenses in your eyes. Lenses in your eyes are quite labile and malleable early on in life, and as you get older, those lenses become less capable of focusing easily. So too, aspects of yourself, your nature, might be highly plastic early on. As you grow older, as you become more set, habituated, you might even say ossified, what in the past might have seemed plastic is perhaps no longer. So that idea of plasticity is something that is ephemeral. You can be, even if it's part of our nature to be plastic, it's something that we lose over time after a certain age, after a certain number of sunsets and seasons and so forth, that plasticity tends to go away, which suggests that, especially when you're relatively young, thinking about those aspects of yourself that can be changed, that can be modified, is part of what it is to be a person, I want to suggest. It's one's very nature is precisely to address that degree of plasticity, work within it, and hopefully to improve upon the basic material that you've got to make yourself into the kind of person that you want to be. So if there's a big picture here, it might be as follows. Human nature is not something that we should think of as there to be discerned by a very powerful internal telescope or microscope, but rather there's something there to be discerned, but a great deal of our nature is precisely that plasticity, precisely that openness to malleability. And if we acknowledge that, then I think we'll be likely to see that it's our responsibility and our opportunity to do something with that plasticity and malleability and make ourselves into the kind of people that we want to be. I'm hoping that as we move into the later parts of this course, the second and the third mini MOOC, we'll get more materials to work with to help us think about the kinds of people that we want to be as we introspect, as we learn more about ourselves, in order to have a good set of guideposts to that self-creation, self-shaping, self-cultivation. I'll see you soon. In addition to those aspects of ourselves that are, what you might think of as our primary nature, that part of our nature that is more or less the result of our biological endowment, then including such things as the basic emotions, happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise. I want to talk a little bit about the things that might go more happily under the rubric of second nature. And if you reflect for a moment on the notion of second nature, you might think that that is a part of yourself that has some role in shaping the activities that you engage in, the choices that you make, but that nevertheless is acquired rather than something that you were born with. You've heard the phrase second nature probably. What does it come to? Well, it seems to me for example, the Asian tradition has had a lot to say about this, going back some centuries. The philosopher Mencius, who was one of the intellectual heirs of Confucius and responded to some Confucian themes, built on some of what he heard from Confucius and his followers. His dates were 372 to 289 BC. He held that the locus of philosophical activity and self-cultivation is what he called the Shin, which he described as the chief organ of the circulatory system and the organ of thought, what he also sometimes referred to as the heart-mind. He writes, pointing out that we have natural tendencies towards sympathy, he writes, supposing people see a child fall into a well, they all have a heart-mind that is shocked and sympathetic. It is not for the sake of being on good terms with the child's parents. It's not for the sake of winning praise for neighbors and friends, nor is it because they dislike the child's noisy cry that, and end of quotation, that someone would be concerned about the well-being of the child. Rather, the heart-mind is one that naturally feels sympathy towards somebody else's suffering. And I suggest that you've probably had a similar experience. Maybe in your country, there was a news story not long ago about a child that fell into a well or slipped into the cage in a zoo of a dangerous animal that was in some other way in peril, and perhaps the entire country was busily refreshing its screen, watching the news online, hoping that there'd be news of a rescue soon for that vulnerable child. That's an example of not just Butler from the Western tradition and David Hume from the Western tradition, but also now we're hearing Mencius saying that something that we have a natural proclivity towards. We have a natural tendency towards caring about the well-being of other individuals, and maybe not just fellow human beings, but many other living creatures as well. However, Mencius would also argue that this natural tendency towards concern for others' well-being is something that needs to be cultivated. It's something which, if not cultivated, could wither and die without it being something that we pay attention to and try to develop. More generally, he wrote about what's now referred to as the four sprouts. He writes, a heart-mind that sympathizes is the sprout of co-humanity. A heart-mind that is aware of shame is the sprout of rightness. A heart-mind that defers to others is the sprout of ritual propriety. A heart-mind that approves and condemns is the sprout of wisdom. If anyone having the four sprouts within himself knows how to develop them to the full, it is like fire catching a light, or a spring as it first bursts through. If able to develop them, he is able to protect the entire world. If unable, he is unable to serve even his parents. So Mencius' idea is that these four sprouts, which we can summarize as benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom, are ones that we might have natural tendencies towards. They're ready to grow, perhaps at birth or in early childhood, but they require some input from us. Just as a gardener who's got some sprouts coming up in her garden needs to make sure they get water, relatively rich soil, and plenty of sunlight, so too, we find sprouts in ourselves, but we can't expect just to let them grow without our input, without our cultivation. We need to do things that help them grow. And that idea of cultivation is one that might raise the question, well, how do I go about cultivating that? Well, in the case of wisdom, for example, we talked about wisdom already when we discussed Socrates and claimed that, and trying to unpack the idea that no one, according to the Delphic Oracle, was wiser than he. Remember that wisdom is not a matter of knowing a lot of information. It's not a matter of knowing a lot of facts. Rather, it's a matter of using the information that we do have in a way that's prudent, in a way that's practical, in a way that supports our or somebody else's well-being. So too, that notion of wisdom is something that I think Mencius would probably welcome and say it requires practice. No one was born wise. It requires trying things and seeing what works for us and others, seeing what does not, pruning accordingly, and developing our sense of wisdom in the process. So too, it seems to me we could say the same thing about our attitudes toward others, the sprout of ritual propriety, for example. Think of that as a pro-social behavior. When we do things like act politely, follow rituals of relatively defined, rigorous kind, or just everyday rituals of saying thank you, for example, we are in the process of developing one of those sprouts that helps us to be an other-directed kind of person. The big picture here is then that human nature comprises at least two different components, one of which is that part of our nature that perhaps is part of our biological heritage, something that is more or less genetically driven, and that we can't do a whole lot about, whereas another part of human nature is going to be second nature, that is developed only over time with effort, with thousands of little choices that we make on a daily basis to do things like hold the door open for someone, to say thank you, to say you're welcome, to send a thank you note, to look at someone when you speak to them as opposed to looking away, to follow what's happening on their face as they describe to you a situation that they just experienced. Those pro-social behaviors might be effortful at first, but could become, or will hopefully become, second nature over time. And then as they become more or less habituated, as long as we still put our hearts into them, as it were, and follow them with a certain amount of sincerity, then they're also likely to become things that are part of our second nature. So second nature, unlike what we can call first nature, is cultivated. It includes these four sprouts that Mencius put his finger on, and something that requires effort. It's not something that happens to us, it's something that we do. And what's difficult to see about that, the reason that's an elusive fact, it seems to me, is that at any given time, we cannot do a whole lot about those things that are second nature to us. At any given time, I'm going to have difficulty changing my habits of interpersonal dealings, for example, the way I talk to people, the way I listen to them, how I go about interacting with others on an everyday basis is something that's more or less habit-driven, but still, with effort and with time, is malleable. So the choices that we make now are things that gradually, in ways that on a daily or even on a weekly basis don't make much obvious differences in ourselves, still make a difference in the long term, especially when we're relatively young and still admit of a certain amount of plasticity. So, remember, Pope wrote in his essay on man, placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great, that middle state he's referring to is something that expresses the idea of ourselves being in large part up to us. We've got to decide who we're going to be. That self-determination, as it were, is something that's easy to miss because that middle state is something that you're in whether you like it or not. And at any given time, there's not a whole lot about your second nature, or for that matter, your first nature, that you can change. But over time, these changes can happen. And over time, it's possible to shape yourself into the kind of person that you want to be. But it requires patience and determination and consistency. What we're going to see in the next MOOC will be two aspects of the self that fall under the rubric of the unconscious. One aspect of the self is the traditional notion of the unconscious that was hypothesized by people like Sigmund Freud. And then we'll be seeing more recent work on the unconscious that has been more powerfully validated by recent work in experimental psychology under the rubric of the adaptive unconscious. Those are both aspects of both first and second nature, particularly the second, that is the adaptive unconscious, is very much the stuff of second nature. And I hope to see you again there when we go more deeply into that subject. Thank you. Another kind of meditative moment I'd like you to engage in with me is what I'm going to call bamboo breathing. And bamboo breathing is just a simple breathing technique that helps you calm yourself, focus your mind, think about something, nothing, again, transcendental or heavily spiritual or mystical, just getting you to monotask by focusing for a moment on your breathing. So this is called bamboo breathing because it's supposed to bring to mind the stalk of a bamboo tree in which you can imagine a stalk that has segments. Those segments should correspond to the way you breathe out, the way you exhale after taking a deep breath. So take a not hugely, but reasonably deep breath, and you'll breathe out segmentally. Maybe 4 out breaths before you want to fill up your lungs again. If we do that, say, 10 times, we'll find ourselves wanting to, I think, calm down, focus, relax, and let the mental waters become more serene. So let's take a deep breath. Bamboo, breathe out. Let's keep on doing that. Thank you.